On March 4th, 1424, the Sunma War was waged on the continent of Nars. The Demon King's army destroyed everything in its path. But in this darkness, the warrior awakened. The last line of hope. This is the essence of this game. In it, you are the hero king of the state of paradise, who fights against the demonic army. The main character devoted all his free time to this game. He knew everything about this game: the plot, character leveling, loot, bugs. He even kept a blog about the game for many years, was in the top. All he did was work and play all day long. That's what killed him. Literally killed him. He woke up with the realization that at 34 years old, he didn't even know what a relationship was, which horrified him. He jumped up in bed trying to catch his breath. There was a girl standing nearby who immediately asked about the king's condition. The guy looked around, not understanding what was happening. He was surrounded by a real mansion, not the room he was accustomed to. After catching his breath a little, he tried to find out where he was and who this girl was in front of him. These questions left the maid even more perplexed. Now he wasn't the only one asking questions. Approaching the mirror, the guy was shocked. A blond man of impressive figure was looking at him from the mirror. And, judging by the window with information about the character, which appeared out of nowhere, with poor gaming characteristics, it began to clear in his head. He died and was reborn as King Jared in the game. Now his favorite game has become a reality. He found himself on January 1st, 1414, on the continent of Nars, the kingdom of Civia. This information scared him. He remembered very well how many troubles had befallen this world, starting from this year. The War of the Host, famine, drought, epidemics, natural disasters. He did not understand how he could cope with it, especially considering that he was reborn as a character far from the one could dream of. Even with all the boy knew about the game, he didn't understand how he could win in such shape. Anger filled him. He twirled in his chair until it broke under his weight. The newly minted king plopped down on the floor. Lost in thought, lying on the floor, the guy nevertheless decided to fight and go to the end. What also gave him fighting spirit was the fact that he knew about bugs in the game that could make his path easier. This knowledge will become his salvation. It will give him an advantage over others. Now the boy has a goal. He will become the best warrior and king this world has ever known. The maid, meanwhile, was cleaning the king's study. Her calm was interrupted by the young king bursting into the room. He immediately rushed to look for something in the office, ignoring the maid's desire to help him. Having found nothing, he nevertheless told the girl that he was looking for a relic left to him by his father before his death. To his surprise, the maid immediately found the necessary item. She was clearly proud that she had been able to help the king, preparing to carry out some more assignments. Instead, the guy simply asked her to leave. The girl was pleasantly surprised by the changes in his behavior, which became clearly more energetic than usual. Left alone, the boy looked at the amulet relic, understanding the importance of this artifact. The amulet is capable of enhancing the magical skills of its owner, but Jared has other plans for it. Suddenly his hand took on a blue glow in an attempt to destroy the relic. It pleased him to think that King Jared was a fourth-class magic user. This will allow him to sacrifice the amulet in exchange for something more important that cannot be achieved through magic alone. A thick red fog rose around, from which a terrifying creature appeared. It gradually took shape and rapidly increased in size. A demonic creature appeared before him, Isabella. Her scarlet eyes sparkled ominously, wanting to know who dared to summon her. Despite her terrifying appearance, the guy controlled his emotions. This was an important condition to please her. This was the only chance to change the course of the game. It was important not to miss the opportunity. In a confident voice, the guy declared that he was eager to obtain the spiritual eye. It is a rare skill that allows you to read people like an open book. By gaining possession of the spiritual eye, Jared would gain a huge advantage. But everything has its price. which is what Isabella stated when she offered to sign the guy a contract. The agreement was that the king would get what he wanted, and in exchange he would give up the most valuable thing he had. Jared began to list in his head everything he held dear. Fearfully, the thought of losing any of it filled him with horror. The demoness easily read his thoughts, trying to grasp what was most valuable to the king. Suddenly, Isabella's lips took on a strange shape. A sly smile appeared on Jared's face. He had guessed the terms of the demoness's contract. The guy deliberately focused on thoughts about the upcoming first kiss, as if it were something very valuable. With this in mind, he managed to outwit Isabella's contract terms. With obvious reluctance, but according to the rules of the contract, the demoness leans in for a kiss, sealing the deal. She allegedly took the most valuable thing, and Jared received the spiritual eye. The servants in the corridors of the castle were actively discussing the obvious changes in the king's behavior. If before he was consumed by laziness, now he suddenly began to be active. Their conversation was interrupted by the running servant Hayes, who was still trying to please the king. She ran into the king's office, bringing him a stack of documents he had asked for. Jared stopped the girl, scanning her with his spiritual eye. Hayes's performance amazed him. The girl was too skilled and devoted for a simple servant. But seeing the level of unrequited love, which was also among the girl's characteristics, the guy became embarrassed. Trying not to appear awkward, he began to study the documents. Suddenly, Hayes broke the silence by apologizing to Jared. It turned out that previously, after almost every assignment, the king would snap at the girl, after which she would have to ask for forgiveness. These character memories surfaced in the guy's head. It wasn't he who had offended her, but Jared, who he had only just now been reborn as. But, nevertheless, the guy immediately began to apologize to Hayes, promising to value her loyalty and help in the future. The girl was so touched by this that tears streamed from her eyes. She threw herself into Jared's arms, promising to always be devoted to him. Although the guy was not a king for long, he is now Jared, and with him all the sins of his character's past. In his huge dining room, the guy began to eat his dinner. On his plates was only plant food. Hayes was clearly bothered by this. This may not be enough for the king to feel good, but Jared was determined to get rid of the extra weight as quickly as possible. The grass on his plates is a specific type that exists only within this game. And although the Merlin herb helps burn fat and speed up metabolism, it nevertheless has a disgusting taste. After the meal, Jared felt his girth decrease a little, but he was prevented from fully enjoying his success by the terrible nausea after this disgusting grass. Hayes placed a plate of soy meat on the table, which she had prepared in advance just in case. The girl again tried to please the king, sparing no effort. Jared shed tears of gratitude, not understanding how the previous king could mock such a perfect servant. Her meat literally saved him from the nauseating taste in his mouth. Continuing with his lunch, Jared returned to studying the documents. The region he was in was located in the north. Not the best location, permafrost, lots of pests and robbers. But there are advantages too. But in order to use them, he must become stronger. Thoughts and dinner were interrupted by the sudden cry of Isabella appearing. She longed to get her spiritual eye back. The demoness was clearly furious at Jared's trick, which she fell for. Now she threatened that she would not leave him alone until he returned the eye to her. 10 years earlier, there was a knock on His Majesty's door, trying to call young Jared. After his father's death, he could not come to his senses, locking himself inside his room. Glagus, bottle in hand, wandered down the corridor, pondering the reasons for the royal meeting. Suddenly he noticed the maids walking in front of him. Without wasting a second, Glagus rushed towards them, hugging them familiarly and greeting Hayes separately. The girl, clearly feeling uncomfortable, greeted him back with her usual politeness, which further amused Glagus. The question was swirling in his mind. How could she prefer this fat king to him? Suddenly he was called out by Mr. Lakis, who shamed the man for his behavior. Hayes was clearly pleased to see Lacus, which could not be said about Glagus. A look of fear appeared on the man's face, which soon turned into irritation. As the head of public order, Glagus clearly did not believe that anyone had the right to reproach him. Trying to offend Lacus, the head of security hastened to remind him of his fruitless attempts to achieve something. The tension around the two grew, and the squabble became increasingly heated. She was stopped only by a remark from Oberon, a gentleman of venerable years who appeared near the men. Irritated, Glagus turned his back, but still made a taunt about Oberon's age and his pitiful fate. This clearly affected Lacus. The man did not understand how such a person could be entrusted with such important powers. Soon, everyone was seated at a huge conference table. Those present whispered, trying to figure out why the king had suddenly gathered them. Moreover, to the surprise of many, Jared was not just sitting, but was carefully looking through some documents. Unable to bear it any longer, Glagus spoke up again, noting that the king had no need for this routine. The man had a much more interesting proposal. He said that he would not mind having a drink with the king instead of this fuss. Jared thoughtfully asked if Glagus was talking about having a drink with him. This trick of Glagus usually worked without fail. Instead of important matters, it was much more pleasant to drink with the king in the company of girls. Watching this scene, Lacus was seething with indignation. He wanted to stop Glagus and his harmful ideas. To everyone's surprise, Jared merely reprimanded Glagus for showing up to the meeting drunk. This shocked not only Glagus himself, but also Lacus, since the king's reaction was usually completely different. The head of security tried to smooth things over by reminding the king of their previous get-togethers. In a moment, a white beam pierced the Glagus bottle. The man was furious. He clearly hadn't expected the king to use magic to put him in his place. Ignoring this, Jared returned to the affairs of the assembly, concerned about Glagus's illicit gains. What he heard shocked the head of security. He was blamed for the decline in the standard of living in the kingdom. The king reminded him of the slave trade, the non-existent taxes, and the secret training of mercenary soldiers. In Jared's hand, it gradually formed into a magical fireball. The king was ready to let him get away with his impudent behavior, but not these offenses. In just a moment, a fireball flew towards Glagus. The man collapsed to the floor, a burn wound visible on his back. Jared could have destroyed him immediately, but he chose to punish him legally. And, for starters, remove him from office. This was not the end. The king was determined to uncover all the crimes that had been going on all this time. Those present immediately fell to their knees, begging the king for mercy. Lacus froze, digesting what was happening. He was actually pleasantly surprised by how the king dealt with Glagus. Jared's voice suddenly brought Lacus back to reality. The king confidently declared that he was now handing over the position of Glagus to Lacus. The man immediately dropped to one knee, bowing his head in respect. There were no objections from those present either. They also knelt down, bowing their heads before the king. A joyful thought flashed through Jared's mind that he was at least a little able to adequately imagine himself in this role. Having scanned those around him with the spiritual eye, the king concluded that these people were not at all fit for the positions they held. Turning around, he met the gaze of Oberon, who was standing calmly behind him. A smile appeared on Jared's face. He realized that with the spiritual eye, he could fix everything. A month passed. Glagus's accomplices, as usual, demanded money from the unfortunate merchant. While intimidating the poor man, the bandits waited for Glagus, who never showed up. This meant that they could keep the spoils for themselves, which suited them just fine. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. The men looked at each other, not understanding who could have come. Opening the door, one of the accomplices saw Jared on the threshold. The bandit clearly didn't take him seriously, making a comment about the king's weight. But, just a moment later, he flew across the room after a strong blow. Lacus appeared in the doorway, who, unlike the king, could not control his rage. Jared himself was not concerned with the words of Glagus's accomplices. He was only concerned with the criminal activities of men. The king ordered the bandits to be captured. Lacus, with great pleasure, began to carry out the order. The men, realizing that they were facing a new head of public order, were horrified. One of their accomplices, who was outside, heard strange sounds coming from inside. He tried to slip away, sensing something was wrong. But the king appeared from the door. He clearly had no plans to let the bandit go. With the help of a magic arrow, Jared quickly dealt with the would-be fugitive. People in the streets rejoiced, shouting praises to the king and Lacus. Now their life will improve because the criminal organization of extortionists was exposed and arrested. Lacus declared that the king would not make the same mistakes again. The matter would not end with the capture of the criminals. The bandits walked under the supervision of Lacus, not understanding how their patron Glagus could screw up. One of the king's new orders was the need to share food with the starving. The jubilant people greeted the king and Lacus on the streets of the kingdom. At the next meeting, Jared was able to sum up the positive results of his actions. The people became more favorable to the king. Lacus also noticed this. The man was also happy with their success. Lacus did an excellent job in his new position and was clearly happy with the promotion, which he told the king in response to his question. A new window with information popped up in front of Jared, informing him that his magical power had increased. Under his leadership, many crimes were solved in the kingdom. The people of Civia were calm. The spiritual eye helped Jared select the best soldiers, who were led by Lacus. But despite all the joy for his success, the king was still pestered by Isabella, who often appeared out of nowhere. Lord Oberyn found his calling in agriculture, a difficult occupation given the harsh climate of Civia. Mr. Abilla was busy advertising internal resources, but it was too early to talk about grandiose results. Jared thought about it. To achieve success, you need to try even harder. His hands were kneading his stomach, which Lacus noticed. The king explained to him that this was an exercise that would help get rid of excess volume. Lacus was amused by what he heard, and his reaction made the king laugh. In fact, what Jared did was a magical practice that improves the level of killing magic. More precisely, it was more of a game bug that the guy successfully exploited. And although the creators of Paradise do not admit the presence of glitches in the game, nevertheless, Jared knew that this was not the case. He thought that using this ability would allow him to maintain his magical power level a little longer. Suddenly, a guard burst into the office, clearly in a hurry to report some important news to the king. He informed Jared that the soldiers had discovered the bandits hiding in the mine. Moreover, they had hostages. The history associated with this mine began a year earlier. The blonde girl watched with admiration as the boys trained and fought with swords. Suddenly, two adults approached her, a man and a woman, who towered menacingly over Lena. She recognized them as Ani and Appa. Her face lit up with joy. The red-haired woman jokingly threatened her that she would be punished for shirking work. Lena grabbed the barrel of water with a smile, clearly preparing to finish everything on time. The girl was already 14. Ani was interested in whether she would really become a servant to a rich man, as the others were saying. Lena confirmed with a smile, "The director found this house for her, an orphan, and she believes that she will be happy there." When the woman learned that the rumors were true, she was upset. She had hoped that she would be able to take the girl into the army. Hearing this, Lena suddenly changed and called out to the boys. She dreamed of becoming a professional warrior, but she didn't know if she could succeed. And, in fact, she didn't want to be a servant. Alpa burst out laughing. After a while, he took out his sword and swung it. Now he looked more serious. Many dreamed of becoming warriors but never realized how dangerous it was. And he wanted Lena to understand that. To become a professional, you don't have to be born a man, but you do have to have special skills and willpower. Oppo knew that Lena could surpass both him and Ani, so he dispelled her doubts about herself. Ani ruffled Lena's hair encouragingly. She was ready to hire the girl as soon as she was ready. But, after some time, fate turned completely unexpectedly for her. Now she is in chains. It turned out that the director had deceived the girl. Instead of working as a maid, he had sold her into slavery. Lena did not want to believe the words of her enslaver. The men around burst into laughter as they watched the deceived girl, who was now trying to silence them. Suddenly, the enslaver took out a whip and hit Lena with all his might, trying to raise the girl to be an obedient and polite slave. She had been here for a month now. Her routine now consisted of beatings and spending time in a cell with the other prisoners. While in captivity, she met another slave girl. The red-haired girl insisted that Lena had repeated the fate of many orphans from Mallorca, who were often sold into slavery. She convinced Lena that the director was simply following the order, and for him she was no different from others. But Lena was adamant. She was not going to give up and was ready to fight for freedom. Mani didn't even think about escaping. It seemed that the red-haired girl had simply resigned herself to her fate. Lena was embarrassed by such pessimism, but Mani confidently called herself a realist. After another month, the girls became close friends. This was a real stroke of luck, since there were practically no other women their age here. Most of the slaves are adults with a dejected appearance who have long been broken. It was much easier to control such people than those whose will had not yet been trampled. The friends were more precious than the other slaves, and perhaps that was what saved them for now. In any case, Lena was not going to give up. After 6 months, the girl gradually got used to the realities of a slave's life. Mani helped her do this. She not only taught Lena, but also told her a lot about Civia, its ruler, and the decline of the country. Lena was interested in how Manya knew so much, and she always answered with a smile that she overheard it from their oppressors. Mani made it clear that there was no need for mercenaries in this country, and there was no point in counting on Ani and Appa. But even this could not make Lena give in. Mani, in turn, appreciated her friend's persistence. A year passed, the girls turned 15. One day, Manya was fast asleep on the cold floor while Lena tried to wake her up. Her friend's cheeks were burning. Her body was hot. Lena couldn't leave her in that state. The warden sitting next to the girl's cell was indignant. He couldn't understand how Glagus could have failed so badly. Because of the king, they were no longer able to commit lawlessness openly, and there was nowhere to sell the slaves. Lena tried to reach the man. She begged for at least a cup of soup for her friend who had a fever. She even knelt down, promising to be obedient in the future, and her prayer was heard. Mani was finally brought a plate of hot broth, but she never touched the food. She watched with alarm as Lena was led away by the overseer, and she had no intention of sitting idly by. The man roughly squeezed Lena's face, clearly planning something evil. But before he could do any harm, a plate of hot broth suddenly flew into his face. The enslaver winced in pain, clutching his burned face with his hands. Without wasting a second, Mani grabbed Lena's hand. The girls started running. Lena didn't understand what had come over her friend and why she had reacted that way. But Mani kept running. She couldn't let something terrible happen to her friend. Lena always said that she would get out of here and that she was not a slave, which is what Mani tried to remind her of during her escape. But suddenly the man's hand grabbed Lena by the collar. He was furious. Taking out a knife, he swung it at her, but instead wounded Mani, who had substituted herself for her friend. Lena reacted immediately, stunning the man with a strong blow to the face. She rushed towards her friend, who was lying motionless on the ground. Tears were pouring from Lena's eyes. She didn't understand why Mani sacrificed herself, but her friend only tried to calm her down. Surrounded by bandits since childhood, Mani saw no future for herself, but she saw it at Lena's. She knew about her friend's dream of becoming a warrior. That's why she threw herself under the knife instead of her friend, wanting to protect her. Mani's last words were a request. She wanted her friend to never give up. Lena promised to go to the end, She was ready to fight again, no matter what it cost her. She glared at the man standing behind her with a bloody knife in his hand. He was frightened by the surprise, but then he suddenly grabbed the girl by the hair, pressing her face to the floor. Enraged, he intended to kill Lena, blaming her and her friend for the burn on his face. Suddenly, a voice came from outside, doubting whether it could be considered a burn at all. And then, a large wave of flame rushed towards the man, burning him completely. This was Jared's doing. He was clearly angry. Now the oppressor knew what a real burn was. A little earlier, Jared, Lakis, and the army arrived at the mine that the military man reported. Apparently, after Glagus was removed from office, they hid here and waited for the time to come out into the light. Lakis put the helmet on his head, preparing for the fight. Jared commanded the army to follow inside the cave. Their mission was to destroy the enslavers who kept people as slaves. Justice demanded it, and after reminding the army to be relentless, Jared and the others rushed inside. It's time for battle. The gang members scattered and tried to find Chad, who was their local leader. But the warriors were not going to give them a chance to escape. Their blades pierced one criminal after another. The fight continued until there was not a single living criminal left in sight. Jared and Lakis now had to figure out where to go next, as the mine was full of forks and tunnels. After thinking for a moment, the king ordered everyone to split up and begin searching for the remaining bandits. So Jared came across the criminal who wanted to kill Lena, and without thinking twice, he hit him with a fireball. In his previous life in games, he wandered into prisons where slaves were held. But now it is a terrible reality. Jared sat down next to Lena, taking her hands in his. He was worried about the girl's condition. Lena insisted that she was fine. But when talking about Mani, she couldn't hold back her tears. The red-haired girl lay dead on the ground. She sacrificed herself for her friend. Unfortunately, Jared knew it was too late. Restoration magic wouldn't help anymore. He hugged Lena, asking for forgiveness for not being there in time. The girl continued to sob, unable to calm down. The king saw that she was also in poor physical condition. Lena was exhausted. Her past was definitely not simple. The sudden appearance of a screaming, clearly tipsy Chad caught them by surprise. The criminal was indignant. He tried to understand what was happening. Upon seeing the king, Chad angrily asked why he was there, which apparently only made Jared more angry. A magic ball appeared in the king's hand. He was eager to destroy Chad as soon as possible. The criminal, continuing to make barbs, also began to form a magical sphere in his palms. A few moments later, a bolt of light flew towards Jared. The king immediately used speed magic to dodge the attack. This left Chad in shock. He clearly didn't expect such magic to be used. Jared circled the criminal at the speed of light. Chad, knowing that speed magic was difficult to control, bet that the king would not be able to maneuver successfully. He began to form another magical clot, intending to destroy everything around him. Before Chad could attack, he felt powerful blows being delivered all over his body. The combination of his drunken state and overly complex magic opened up a lot of holes for Jared to attack. Chad fell to the ground. The king sarcastically noted that he was too weak when he delivered the finishing blow. New windows popped up with information that stated the successful completion of the mission and an increase in the loyalty of the population. The mine case was closed and the criminals were exterminated. All those involved in Chad's actions were also executed, and the people who suffered from the slave trade were soon sent back to their families. The king suggested that Lena stay in Civia, because if she returned to the shelter, she could again suffer a bad fate. The girl was obviously talented. Jared needed such allies. He was ready to take care of her. He also promised that the girl would be able to become a knight, after which Lena immediately began to thank the king. Her enthusiasm knew no bounds, and she regained hope that her dream would come true. Jared thought about it. He never thought that he would meet Lena on his way, because she was not just a girl. He remembered that in this game, Lena was the strongest warrior in the demon army. It seemed impossible to defeat her. Lena was superior to any of the Demon King's army. The fortresses she guarded were an unattainable target. And now Jared has a chance to prevent her from siding with the demons in the future. The king is already preparing for the upcoming War of the Host, and if Lena is on their side, it will be a great success. One of the problems was also Majorca, where lawlessness was rampant. Horus, king of Majorca, was swimming in criminal money. Horus himself had heard about Crivia's successes, and this irritated him quite a bit. The king of Majorca turned to Frua, who had previously been in close contact with Glagas. Frua was ready to take action, including to repay his friend. Under cover of night, an unknown man made his way into the territory of the kingdom of Crivia. He moved across the rooftops to avoid the attention of the guards who were on duty on the streets. On his back he carried a bag with unknown contents. Having reached a quiet alley, the man threw off his bag. The moon illuminated his face, which was half covered by a black cloth for camouflage. The king in Lena's run was clearly much easier for the girl. On the last lap, Jared could barely keep up with Lena. At the end, both were in high spirits. The girl, after a long confinement, was glad of the fresh air. Jared, out of breath, promised Lena to find a teacher. But for now, they would train together. Fatigue knocked the king off his feet. Jared's meal again included the disgusting but miraculous herb. Hayes delivered him a message from Lord Oberyn and Abiel. The news was good. Lena, sitting next to him, was also interested. The king shared with her Oberyn's successes in agriculture, which was a very important achievement, since a lot of money was spent on importing products. And Isabella improved the crystal mining process, greatly increasing the income. Lena enthusiastically stated that Crivia was thriving, although Manny said that the kingdom was in decline. Jared was happy with the success, realizing that this was only the beginning, and soon people would talk about Crivia again. Lacus entered the room. He had important news. After some time, he and the king were walking, discussing the terrible discovery. This discovery was the corpse of a monster, from whose open mouth many sharp fangs were visible. Lacus blamed himself. He should have tightened his security. Jared didn't blame him because their kingdom was very small and had no defensive fortresses, and it seemed that no one had been hurt yet. The king wondered who could have done something like this because the people were pleased, which meant it was someone outside. Suddenly, they heard a cry for help. The girl asked some man to save her mother, promising him anything in return. She grabbed hold of him, but the man resisted. Jared called out to the girl, wanting to know her name. She certainly didn't expect to see the king himself in front of her, as did the people around her, who were now watching everything. Jared wanted to know what kind of medicine she needed. The girl introduced herself as Mia. As it turned out, her mother was sick with Renel's disease. The king was horrified when he heard the name of the disease, but Mia was sure that there was a cure. The man Mia begged for help panicked and insisted that there was no medicine that could cure the disease. Jared considered the options, including the priest's blessing or medicine from the land of Etim. This disease affects the lungs. It is most often contracted from monsters or in dungeons. The king leaned towards Mia and, to her surprise, asked her to take him to his sick mother. His face lit up. He knew how to help. Mia led him to the house where she lived with her sick mother. Everything inside indicated that the family lived in poverty. Having climbed up to the second floor, Mia rushed to her sick mother's bed. She wanted to please her with the news of her imminent rescue, but his mother, mistaking Jared for a doctor, only asked him to leave, saying that she did not have money for treatment. The icon that popped up next to her indicated that the woman had no more than a week left. Mia tried to explain to her mother that Jared wasn't a healer. He was a king, and he was here to help. Mary turned to the king. It became clear that they had met before. As it turned out, 8 years ago she worked in the kitchen of the palace. Realizing what Jared's character was like before him, he rushed to apologize to the woman. The king sat down next to the woman's bed despite her attempts to prevent him. since the disease could be contagious. Having instructed Mia to bring a wet towel, he suddenly became more serious, left alone with the woman. Immediately going to the window, he became convinced of what he had already thought. Down on the road lay a monster. It wasn't the first time the woman had seen them, he was convinced when he asked her. She worked in the kitchen of a squad that was engaged in extracting crystals from monsters. This disease is transmitted only by contact with the monster, and it does not manifest itself for a long time. After seeing the monster under the window, the woman felt worse. She was also worried about who could have done this. Hayes and Lena appeared on the threshold, holding in their hands the medicine the king had asked for. In an attempt to boost the woman's morale, Jared insisted that she trust him. Mary burst into tears. She was very grateful to the king and wanted to somehow repay his generosity. Jared simply insisted that the most important thing for her now was to get well. A masked criminal was on guard on the roof, the same one who brought the monsters to Civia. He clearly did not believe in the king. Suddenly, a voice was heard behind him, insisting that the king would cope. It was Lakis, and so the criminal showed up at the scene of the crime. Everything happened as Jared predicted. Lakis's face was burning with rage. He was sure that it was this man who brought the disease to the kingdom. Meanwhile, Hayes was pounding herbs in a mortar to make medicine. The girl could not even imagine that these components could become a miraculous cure for Renel. Jared boiled the ingredients in a flask, distilling them into a separate container. He learned about this recipe in his past life when one of the players leaked it to the Paradise Game website. Mary, still lying exhausted on the bed, turned to the king. She wondered why he was so concerned about the illness of a commoner. As it turned out, he had experienced firsthand the horrors of terrible diseases and poverty. In his past life, he grew up in a family where everyone loved each other. But something terrible happened. His mother became very ill. Being poor, they could not afford the examination. And when the opportunity finally arose, it was too late. The cancer had progressed to the last stage. The guy was angry with himself because he couldn't help her. Even after 15 years, he still blames himself for this. That's why Mia's story resonated with him so much. Jared couldn't let the girl go through the death of her mother, as he had to do in his time. Meanwhile, the fight between Lakis and the criminal continued on the roof. It became increasingly difficult to dodge enemy attacks. The criminal moved quickly and confidently. One of the attacks even passed right past Lakis's neck, but fortunately, he managed to react. He leaned on his opponent with his sword, trying to gain an advantage in the fight. The criminal had no intention of giving up and escaped at great speed, and then he struck with all his might. But to his surprise, Lakis remained standing just as before. This clearly shocked the masked man. Lakis didn't seem to even feel anything in particular. Without wasting any time, he attacked the enemy. The blow was so strong that he literally flew upward. The criminal did not expect Lakis to be so strong. He wondered where he got so much power from. The real reason lay in the characteristics of the head of public order protection. During the fight with the criminals, he was filled with a sense of justice, which took his strength to a completely different level. Villains could expect no mercy when they met him, the embodiment of justice. The criminal planned to kill Lakis when they met, but apparently he was not destined to realize this idea. So he decided to retreat. Before this, he laughed slyly and hinted at their repeat duel in the near future. Lakis was not going to let him go, but suddenly he was enveloped in smoke. This allowed the criminal to escape. 2 days later, Mia sat on the floor and watched the magical performance. First, a ball of mana appeared in Jared's hand, which he created using only his imagination. And in the other, a magical clot appeared, but this time created through strong concentration. Mia suggested that they could only practice one type of magic, but Jared objected. It is necessary to master both methods, because when meeting with an evil magician, the first option will be useless. Mia was clearly confused when she heard that if a mage only knew the first method, he would not be able to cast spells in a certain situation. Jared continued his lecture on the need to practice the method of strong concentration. But Mia was still interested in why the king chose such an unconventional image for the lecture. Smiling, Jared removed his fake mustache and cape. He wanted to create the right atmosphere for the role of a magical mentor. The girl commented sarcastically on his image and in response heard playful reproaches for his straightforwardness. Hearing that it was time for breakfast, Mia immediately rushed to the table, forgetting that the lesson was not over yet. After Mary asked if she was disturbing them, everyone headed to the kitchen. The king wanted to try her dishes himself. The woman really wanted to impress the guest, although she probably should have rested a little longer. Mary convinced Jared that she was already healthy, and as a token of gratitude, she cooked soy meat, according to his diet. Isabella's head suddenly appeared from the wall, watching them. The demoness noticed changes in Jared's behavior. Magic clots flew around the room, sparkling. Jared sat in the lotus position, concentrating mana around himself. People usually try to find the easiest way, but as a result, they miss the chance to develop mastery. Jared's practice had paid off. He had mastered a new training method and now he had to name it. His method was not only about training with bugs, but also about working with the mana of the mage race. This method helped increase the power of magic by 6 points. Using this method will become his main training. Jared, thinking about the name, finally decided single-player bug user. Isabella, who had appeared out of nowhere, noted that, although she had followed many magicians, this was the first time she had seen such a method. Jared, raising his head to the demoness, was surprised that she was able to see magical flows. She was alarmed by what she saw. Too much went against the established rules, but the mana level was normal. Something about him was alien, clearly not of this world. Now she wanted to know the truth. Jared's eyes widened in fear when he heard Isabella's question. He tried to pretend that he didn't understand what the demoness was talking about. But Isabella's assumptions reassured the king. She had no idea that he had been reborn in another world. Her options boiled down to the fact that he was simply from another continent or the Eastern Empire. Jared tried to lie that he had heard similar options from his ancestors, but the words about the Empire made him think. Even in his past life, he never saw this card come out in the game Paradise. Noticing the guy's thoughtfulness, the demoness became even more interested in what was happening. She wanted to know more than Jared had told her, especially since he was the only one who could see her and be her interlocutor. Approaching the boy, she opened his eye with her fingers. But the king was not going to give her the spiritual eye. This reaction did not embarrass the demoness. She was ready to forget about the eye, giving him the ability as a wedding gift. Isabella was clearly impressed by the appearance of the thinner king, which she did not hide. Jared's face twisted at what he heard. Now it was clear why she was staring at him while he was sleeping. The demoness saw the king as a wonderful match for herself, especially considering that it was she who took his first kiss. While she was thinking about their possible relationship, Jared took off running, making up excuses to get away on the go. During the carriage ride, Hayes read to the king a letter from Lacus about Lena's amazing success. Lacus also noted that it would be worthwhile to find her a teacher, because soon his lessons would become useless. The king, smiling, asked Hayes to inform Lacus that he would find her a worthy mentor. Jared began to list in his head the options for teachers for the girl. Suddenly, an arrow pierced the carriage window. The king used magic in time, saving Hayes from being wounded. The unexpected attack left him confused. Shouts from outside announced an ambush. Guards prepared to protect the king. The robbers continued to shoot at the cart with their bows. Jared created a magical shield and protected himself and Hayes from danger. The girl suddenly rushed at the king, trying to cover him with her body. The king tried to stop Hayes because it was too dangerous, but the girl was stubborn. Even though she was a servant, she considered it her duty to protect him. Jared threatened Hayes into staying in the cart while he went out to investigate what was going on. a new wave of arrows flew towards him again. The king was obviously irritated by these pathetic attacks. He used the magic shield again. Isabella's head appeared behind his ear, offering her help. But Jared wanted to figure it out himself. Through the transparent magical cover, he saw a crowd of archers. They exchanged a few words, realizing that there was a magician in front of them. One of the archers was Thog, the mage killer, who had been given a mission by the masked criminal to kill Jared. The king immediately understood that they were talking about a criminal who had planted a monster in his kingdom. Thog, not wanting to waste any more time, launched a direct attack, armed with an axe and a club. The second archer he had spoken to earlier was a newbie. Thog wanted to show him a master class. Using the spinning slaughter technique, he approached the king with lightning speed, and then he fired a sharp disc at Jared's face. The king immediately used speed magic and a magic arrow, but the enemy dispelled them. Thog dealt a powerful blow with his club to the king's head. Thinking he had won, he was surprised to see Jared unharmed and back behind his shield. The stupor quickly gave way to another series of quick attacks. The one in front was a mage of at least level 4. Knowing this, he couldn't afford to slow down. The slightest hesitation and the advantage would be lost. The battle was watched by worried royal guards and mocking bounty hunters, but suddenly the course of the battle changed dramatically. Jared managed to grab the club and immediately felt its magical power. While the king examined the staff, wanting to keep it for himself, Thog again froze in a stupor. With the help of physical strength-enhancing magic, Jared managed to take the artifact away. The thug didn't understand how he screwed up so badly. He underestimated the enemy. The king's magic paralyzed his body. Taking advantage of the situation, Jared decided to find out information about the person who ordered the attack, the masked criminal. In exchange for his life, Thog was willing to share what he knew, which Jared seemed happy about. But his smile suddenly changed to seriousness. He suddenly delivered the decisive blow. Still, he was not used to trusting bandits. The young lad sat behind a locked door, thinking about his failure. What was the point of him hiring security that Thog killed anyway? Looking out from behind the barred window, he heard a conversation between Thog and the masked criminal. They were discussing the drug dealer. The thug seemed unconcerned by the masked man's warnings about his protection. Thog was confident in himself. All he cared about was getting paid for his work. The masked criminal paid him a portion and led him to the road leading to Renel. He was sure that the king would definitely go there to sell a cure for the fatal disease. The boy, still watching them, dreamed that at least someone would stop the thug. And his dream came true when he saw Jared disarm Thog. And then he used a fireball, ending the fight with victory. The boy rejoiced, because now he would be saved. A little while later, Aki, clinging to the king, was already thanking him for saving him. Jared took him along on the trip. The king sighed heavily. The boy did not understand at all what personal space was. After the remark, Aki blushed. He completely lost his head from joy. The boy said that he came for a deal with crystals, but fell into Toga's trap. Jared's face sank. He was the one who failed to provide adequate security in that area. But the boy seemed to be quite pleased with the fact that he had been saved. Jared recognized him as Arcanes. This boy had an amazing sense of fashion and demand, which allowed him to become an outstanding merchant in the future. In the future, he will also make a fortune and buy a kingdom in the East. It's amazing that Jared met him in his kingdom. Under the guise of kindness, the king proposed a mutually beneficial agreement. Arcanes will have to sell the medicine in Renel instead, and in return will receive 15% of the profit. The boy thought about it. Jared hoped for his consent. He was an outstanding person who could be of use to him. To the king's surprise, Arcanes wanted to receive the fulfillment of 2 of his requests instead of profit. He insisted that he could help with trade, and that the king would probably want to know what requests he would ask to be fulfilled. The first request was to call him Aki. The boy blushed as he uttered his wish. Jared's expression was clearly stupefied, but he gave his consent. Isabella, who appeared behind him, was indignant. Upon arriving in Renel, Hayes noticed that the place was not as gloomy as she had imagined. Arkeens smiled. Indeed, many people think so, but the treasures outweigh the darkness in the end. The boy knew that if it weren't for the famous Renel disease, the kingdom would have prospered. Their new business begins with gratitude, but Aki is sure that he has not done enough yet. Jared walked up to a huge barrel, which contained the future medicine. After filling the jar with liquid, new notifications appeared, stating that the mission to make the medicine had been completed successfully. His skills in preparing medicinal herbs also improved. But Jared was focused on another warning about a certain limitation of the drug. Trying to act natural, Jared handed the bottle to Aki. Now it was his turn to act. The boy took up his position behind the counter and was already meeting the first customer infected with Renel. The man's name was Tallinn. He didn't have much money, but he managed to negotiate a price of 1 gold with Aki. It wasn't difficult, so it made Tallinn doubt that the boy was not a charlatan. But Aki was quick to dispel doubts and, as a result, still received payment. He immediately took out the contract that Tallinn had to sign after the purchase, which surprised him. The contract stated that the right to this medicine would be transferred to him, which made the man even more taken aback. But he still put his signature and drank the contents of the bottle. He had nothing to lose, after all. He was terminally ill. Jared warned the man that the drug would take effect in half an hour and that he would be there to monitor the situation. The man still couldn't believe his luck, but Jared hastened to convince him otherwise, promising generous compensation if anything happened. While Tallinn was gone, preparations for the trade continued. Aki, waving his hand, also went to prepare something. Jared went back to making his medicine, filling a bottle with the contents of the barrel. At the end, the icons again reported on the growth of mastery and the daily limit on skill leveling. In this game, potion-making skill increases depending on the result of the preparation. But there is also a downside: restrictions on skill levels for 24 hours based on the criteria of the created product. But Jared found a way to avoid this limitation for himself by transferring the right to make the potion to another player. Thus, all data, except for the skill level, was transferred to Tallinn, including a fine for a day. After 2 hours, Aki was still not there. But suddenly, a roar was heard, and a boy appeared on the horizon, followed by a crowd. Hayes and Jared watched in amazement. These people seemed to be running straight towards them. Ahead of everyone was a clearly joyful Aki, and behind, among the crowd, Tallinn was visible. People rushed to Jared, begging him to sell them the medicine. Each of them tried to get to the front of the line. Hayes again took a protective pose in front of the king, protecting him from the crowd. But there was nothing to be afraid of. People were rejoicing at the Crivian's invention. Hearing their delight, Jared and Hayes couldn't help but smile. But the smiles disappeared from their faces when they heard that they were now discussing the fat king of Civia, who had finally come to his senses. Aki continued to raise the price of the item, shouting that the offer was only valid for today. The lucky ones who bought the medicine immediately began to drink it. The crowd's discussion now turned to the monsters in the Civia forests. This area will become a lure for hunters who want to make money. While Jared and Hayes were busy trading, Aki kept repeating that the medicine was cheaper in Civia. People kept handing him their money, wanting to get the bottle as quickly as possible. The first day of trading was coming to an end. It was getting dark outside, and the guys had already settled in the house. Hayes had been asleep for a long time. She was clearly tired from such a busy schedule. The king, meanwhile, was counting the income, which exceeded all expectations. Indeed, the hunters from Renel were not poor. His thoughts were interrupted by Aki's voice. The boy was also still awake and had come to receive his reward. He never told Jared about the second wish during the trip to Renel, but it seems the time has come. Placing his hand on his chest, Aki finally asked to be made the head of the Merchants' Union. He wanted to serve the king and knew that his talent would be useful in Civia. Despite his young age and inexperience, he believed in his own strength. Jared was pleasantly surprised by his courage and straightforwardness. The king himself wanted to develop their business relations in the future, but he could not immediately appoint him as the manager of the Merchants' Union. Aki bowed his head and listened to Jared's answer, agreeing with the king. The king continued his speech. He listed all of Aki's merits. After all, the boy was truly special. And since the manager's position was open, Jared decided to take a chance. Aki thanked the king without stopping. Now the boy had received the post he wanted, and tomorrow the road back to Civia awaited them. Jared was waiting for this. He already missed his kingdom. Feeling the gusts of spring wind, he admired the stars on the balcony. The bug allowed the potion-making skill to be increased to level 35, and the reward was knowledge about the automation of production. Now they also have access to potions of medium concentration. The profit from sales was high. The medicine was sold only in Civia, attracting hunters who destroyed monsters in the local forest. This increased the production of crystals, which, along with medicines, attracted traders. They flocked to Civia in search of profit. The kingdom prospered. It all started with a medicine, and eventually led to fame that spread beyond the kingdom. Jared was racing through the forest on horseback, and Isabella, having reappeared, decided to keep him company. She was worried that he was traveling alone to an unknown destination. She even suggested that he wanted to commit suicide. Having worked herself up, the demoness began to panic and dissuade the guy from an idea that he had never even thought of. He was just on his way to hunt the monster Dueling. But this made Isabella even more excited. Her emotions were too bright. The demoness knew that the Lich was powerful. His dark magic could harm Jared, but the king seemed unfazed. He, on the contrary, was confident in his abilities because he knew everything about Duca. This monster is a Lich that lives in its lair. The Demon King himself chose it and released it from its lair during the War of the Host. From his past life, Jared remembered that one of the missions in the game was necessarily connected with Dueling. He is already strong, and even considering that he can be killed by divine power, we cannot allow him to become stronger. Isabella looked at the king suspiciously. He knew too much for a common man. Theories about his unearthly origins began to arise in her head again, which Jared awkwardly denied. The refuge of the Lich Duca was like a huge cave castle, against which the king seemed like a bug. Jared immediately began looking for some kind of crack. He was not sure if it existed now that he was reborn. Isabella watched him with affection. He reminded her of a puppy looking for a bone. But she still couldn't understand why they were messing around here instead of going to look for the Lich. Jared was looking for a secret passage to Dueling, and was perhaps glad he wasn't alone. The traps inside could be a serious problem. The frozen corpses at the entrance only confirmed the danger of this place. Suddenly, Jared's hand partially disappeared into the wall. He had finally found the secret entrance. After passing through the wall, Jared and Isabella found themselves inside Duca's secret room. Knowing the game's bugs helped the king again, and gave him a chance to defeat the monster. The room was strewn with gold and filled with jewels. The treasures were intended for the warriors who managed to defeat Duca, which is why there were so many of them. Approaching one of the shelves, Jared found the ring he needed. Putting it on his finger, the king explained to Isabella that it was not just a decoration, but a spatial bag. And, just a moment later, using the ring, Jared pulled all the gold from the room into the artifact. The demoness was worried, because stealing from the Lich promised even greater problems. But Jared disagreed with her. These things didn't belong to Dueling, but to the people he had destroyed. This is what the king wanted to take revenge for. Now he had even more artifacts. Among them, Queen Mariella's earrings, which increase strength, necklace of the Supreme Seer Gorkas, which gave control over human needs, and the ring of the wise Ifnosa, which allowed the use of divine powers. In the throne room, The Lich sat in chains. He groaned. His thin hands were in shackles from which he could not escape. Having lost the vessel of life force, he was weak. Dueling entertained himself only with thoughts of freedom and the desire to turn all people into undead. Suddenly, Jared's hand fell on his head. The king teased the Lich, advising him to think better of his behavior. Dueling looked up at the guy, not understanding who was in front of him. Sparks appeared under Jared's hand, and a moment later, a huge flash of fire enveloped the Lich. The king confidently declared that he would become the main hero of this world. Dueling, enraged by the boy's impudence, changed his appearance. Now he is not an old man, but a skeleton engulfed in flames. Jared immediately jumped away from him, increasing his distance and ignoring the question of how he dealt with the traps. Before him was a fiend of hell, who had once received this power in exchange for his humanity. His powers violated all worldly laws. By infusing his image with magic, he controlled it from a distance, independently of his real body. But Dueling lost his life force vessel to the sacred maiden. His soul is trapped inside his body, making him weaker. Jared charged, trying to keep his distance so the Lich couldn't suck out his life force. The monster was also preparing to attack. The Lich's magical pillars exploded all around the perimeter of the room, but Jared did not lose hope of victory. Forming arrows from mana, he fired them at Dueling. They rushed at great speed, quickly covering the distance between the monster and the king. But the Lich, shielding himself, seemed unimpressed. He concluded that it was low-level magic. A moment later, another group of arrows flew, and Dueling felt one of them hit him right in the head. Now he realized his mistake. The guy was definitely a mage of at least level 3, and he was wasting a lot of energy to continuously attack. Divine power flowed through his body, and the Lich was terrified. He noticed the Ifnosa ring on Jared's finger, which allowed him to use this power. Now he did not understand how the king was able to get this ring, which was in his vault. The embittered Dueling sought to end the fight. A clot of magic appeared in his hands again. Suddenly, Jared appeared in front of his face, breaking through the shield with a fireball. An explosion of flame engulfed the throne and the Lich sitting on it. As Jared suspected, continuous attacks work well against this monster. Although it would take many more powerful blows to kill Dueling, the boy's fighting spirit did not leave him. The Lich was still engulfed in flames. The boy knew his weaknesses too well, but he was still on his own territory. The monster called for reinforcements. His knights, the walking dead, appeared in the throne room. They were the same fiends of hell as the Lich, who frightened with their very appearance. Isabella hastened to tell Jared about them, but the king had already seen everything with his own eyes. The guy thought the Lich's army would be in the trap-lined corridors, but here they are. Looks like the pattern has changed. Dueling was serious because Jared reminded him of the suffering that had not surfaced in his consciousness for a long time. The king ran. He had to block the Lich before he used his highest-level magic. Isabella was no longer content to just watch. She also entered the battle, possessing the largest of the troops. The other undead didn't understand at first what had just happened. But when Isabella, already in a new body, turned to face them, the Lich's knights were horrified. She entered the battle swinging her sword. Although she didn't like her new appearance, she was quite satisfied with her body strength. Dueling was clearly irritated that the demoness had gotten involved in the fight. He pierced her newfound body with a magical charge. But while he was distracted by Isabella, Jared was able to attack. The boy launched a magical lightning spear at the Lich, having managed to praise the demoness for her contribution before doing so. Lightning struck Dueling, sending powerful bolts through his body. Without missing a beat, Jared used his magic staff to immediately release the next sphere to attack. This time the Lich managed to react, erecting a protective wall in front of himself. But suddenly the wall let in a flash, and then the king's attack. Duke didn't expect the guy to use 2 spells at once. Jared chuckled. Double magic was his ace up his sleeve. He placed his finger with the ring on the staff and charged it with holiness. The next attack was filled with divine power. Once inside the Lich, she seemed to have finished him off completely. Now his skeleton emitted neither magical energy nor demonic fire. Isabella couldn't believe her eyes. She never thought they could defeat Duke. Now Jared was able to move closer to him, while listening to Isabella praise herself. Suddenly the skeleton regained its purple glow. Duke was still alive, and he immediately tried to attack Jared. But the king reacted in time, hitting him with his staff. The boy's eyes glowed red as he used the spiritual eye. He knew that the Lich couldn't be killed so easily. Putting holiness into his next strike, he attacked Duca once more. He groaned, struck by divine energy. For the first time as a Lich, the monster felt fear for its life. But it could escape. The shackles held it tightly. Suddenly he burst into another stream of magic. His fear turned to rage. He screamed, as if reminding himself that he was the most powerful dark magician who commanded death. His ardor increased greatly, and his appearance became even more terrifying. He was burning with hellish power. He was determined to fight Jared again. But now, more than ever, he wanted to win. The king's face became more serious. He was preparing for the next round. The Lich's attacks exploded here and there. Jared, hiding behind a magical barrier, did not allow them to reach him. It clearly took a lot of effort for him because magic was literally pouring out of Duca in a stream. In the end, his barrier couldn't hold up, shattering into tiny pieces, exposing the boy to the Lich's attack. Duke, shouting out death wishes, did not slow down. One of his magic arrows was already a few millimeters from the king's face, paralyzing him with fear. The only thing that saved him was that Isabella managed to react and covered him with a shield. The Lich was already quite tired of the daemoniss constantly interfering. He attacked successfully, piercing her chest with his magic. Isabella had to leave her body. She was worried about whether they could really win. Jared calmed the demoness down by telling her that he would never lose to the Lich. Although he was initially taken aback by his attacks, he soon realized that the basic techniques remained the same. In his past life, he had encountered Duke in the game many times, so he knew him inside and out. The guy rushed towards the Lich again. He, using a huge magical paw, tried to crush Jared while he was running. But the king managed to stop in time, right before the place where the paw struck. This surprised the Lich. Jared just smiled, declaring his confidence and challenging the monster. Lich was skeptical of the words of a guy who, as he believed, was only running and dodging. He didn't understand how the king expected to kill him. But Jared was really confident. He rushed towards Duke, holding his staff sparkling with magic towards him. The Lich realized in horror that the boy had tricked him. Before this, Jared only used weak techniques, but now he uses level 4 magic. He strengthened the magic, creating a chain of holy seals that burned the Lich's entire body with divine energy. Duke groaned, feeling unbearable pain. The king knew that it was not so difficult to seal the shapeless monsters. Continuing to attack, Jared invested holiness into his magical energy, still using the ring. Everything around sparkled. The Lich fell apart into pieces. Another flash of light after the attack. The monster was smoking. Now the king stopped to offer him surrender. The Demon King clearly had no intention of appearing here to help the Lich. His situation was not the best. But Duke, of whose skeleton almost nothing remained, resisted. All that remained of the skull was a fragment with an angry, burning eye, but it still continued to threaten the king. Jared laughed it off, obviously enjoying teasing the cocky Lich. The monster suddenly became interested in what the guy wanted to achieve with this, to which Jared seriously stated that he wanted to become the strongest of the kings. Letting out a laugh, Duke clearly did not believe in the guy's strength and that his dream was achievable. The Lich promised that he would now watch him from hell to see how his fate would turn out. Isabella was uneasy about Jared's seriousness. He wasn't the strongest, but he had more than enough confidence. When the Lich finally disappeared, the king warmed up a bit, content with his victory. Now the bracelet he was here for was his. The growth artifact was a unique thing, and while Jared was happy that he was able to get it, Isabella saw some book lying on the floor. She called out to the king, telling him of her discovery, which was probably left behind by the monster after its death. Jared crouched down, picking up the book to examine it. He had never picked up anything like it in a game before. It turned out to be a book of spells, and not ordinary ones, but resurrection spells. Having resurrected someone, he became subject to the spellcaster. To refuse his will meant to disappear forever. Isabella studied the artifact indignantly. The conditions for using spells seemed like slavery to her. Throwing the book aside, she irritably tried to find out what orders he would give her after resurrecting her. Jared informed her that she would have to tie him up first, and then use the curse against him. Isabella clearly didn't expect to hear that. The king explained to her that repeated use of the spell would help increase her resistance and resilience. Isabella looked at him skeptically, thinking that she had finally found his flaw. After asking if that was the end of his ideas for future orders, she finally agreed. She was already pretty tired of being a spirit, and she didn't want to miss the chance to have a body. Without wasting any time, Jared walked towards the body he had found for resurrection. When the ritual was finished, the king sighed heavily, feeling the weight on his back. Isabella jumped on him from behind, justifying herself by saying that she was not yet used to her new body. Although her memory was erased after her resurrection, she did not like her name. Now she demanded to be called Isabel. The girl kept grumbling. She was cold, and Jared's strange tastes became a reason for teasing. The king was pleased that her indicators remained the same, but the presence of her former character pleased him much less. He continued to carry her on his back as he navigated the corridors of Duca's hideout. There were corpses everywhere, but that wasn't surprising, since they were passing through a trap zone that the king had previously managed to disarm. Isabel's new body belonged to an unknown girl, imprisoned in a flask in one of the rooms of the Lich's refuge. Isabel hoped that the girl did not become an evil spirit, because her fate was clearly not simple. But suddenly, turning on her optimism, Isabel assumed that the girl would even be grateful to her. After all, she will try to live a happy and dignified life. She will dress well, eat, and have fun. Suddenly she leaned closer to Jared's ear to ask if she would get bored with him. And, having received a satisfactory answer, she smiled. The king was also glad to have a new companion. Their journey continued. Among the trophies was a Duca bracelet. It enhanced characteristics by accumulating negativity from creatures within a radius of 50 meters. The book that allowed spirits to be resurrected, and which Jared had already managed to test on Isabel. And also the Ring of Sacred Grace, which protected the owner's soul and protected his mind. Jared chose the path with traps for a reason, because now he will receive the title Passing Traps, and will have his stats increased. Meanwhile, in the neighboring state of Renel, there was indignation. The number of hunters in the area decreased, and all because of Civia, which sold the cure for Renel's disease only on its territory. This attracted hunters to flock there. The government even had to hire specialists to produce an analog of the medicine. But this did not help. The Civians carefully guarded the recipe, and even with a sample it was not possible to create an analog. The king of Renel became furious at this, lashing out at his subordinate. He even chased the poor guy out of the office. It infuriated him that Jared, the young king of Civia, had managed to achieve such success, and the man clearly had no intention of leaving it like that. Burning with anger, he decided to act in his own way. The king of Majorca sat sprawled on his throne, with a girl on his lap. Despite the situation, the topic of conversation with the subordinate was serious. Horus was interested in the number of troops. He had 1,239 warriors at his disposal who were ready to do everything for their master. But these numbers clearly did not satisfy him. Too few for a war with Jared, a fourth-class mage. The king of Civia has become a powerful rival. Knowing this earlier, Horus would have ordered Glagus to destroy him. His thoughts were interrupted by the return of his personal mage, Akron. The magician held a staff in his hand and smiled broadly. Behind him stood several more people in cloaks. These people are also magicians who were well paid for their service to the king of Mallorca. Horus approached one of them, asking what class of magic he possessed. Their level corresponded to Class 3. Akron stated that they are now definitely ready to attack Civia. Hearing this, the king grinned and let out a laugh. He could finally put his plan into action. Jared and his retinue, meanwhile, were in the forest, which was located in the northernmost part of the continent. Isabella knew that the king wanted to establish diplomacy, but relations with Renel and Mallorca remained tense. But as it turned out, Jared meant tribes, not kingdoms, which was why they were here now. The king stopped his horse and froze. In front of him, on the rocks, unusual figures with pointed ears were visible. Isabella also tensed up when he noticed them. To his surprise, there were red goblins in front of them. The armed creatures did not seem friendly. Oberyn also commented on what he saw. He couldn't even imagine that they lived here. Soon, the entire retinue was surrounded by goblins. The warriors immediately rushed to defend the king. Lacus gave the order to begin the defense and not to attack first. The soldiers looked at each other in confusion, but still carried out the order. Isabella watched the events with alarm. Neither side attacked, but only took cover behind their shields. Suddenly, a goblin, who was clearly taller and more elegant than the others, moved towards the retinue. He greeted the people. Introducing himself as Ibaneba, he explained that he was the leader of the Red Goblins. Oberyn was surprised that he spoke their language. Jared introduced himself in response. Ibaneba listened to him and asked about his intentions in traveling here to their land. The king wanted to establish diplomacy and a mutually beneficial exchange of resources. The leader chuckled. He waited to see what Jared would offer in exchange for their gold and iron. And when a cart with resources for exchange appeared, Isabella was taken aback. Jared was offering them a nightmare stone. The problem was that there were a lot of these stones in the nightmare forest. They had no value. They were indeed beautiful, but useless. Lacus tensed, hoping that such a proposal would not anger Ibaneba. The goblin leader picked up one of the stones to examine it more closely. He immediately realized what kind of stones they were, and that no one needed them. His calmness seemed to give way to anger, because Jared was offering him absolute trash in exchange. Isabella panicked, a bead of sweat rolling down his cheek. Suddenly, Ibanebu's face brightened. He was glad that, despite the weight of the burden, the king and his retinue had delivered these stones here. Shaking Jared's hand, he thanked the guy for the stones, which were so valuable to the goblins. And now the peace agreement was signed. Now the goblins and the Civians are allies. Jared beamed and thanked Ibaneba, hoping their friendship would last forever. The Goblin King ordered that gold and iron be brought, and, hurriedly, the goblins brought bags with valuable contents. The iron and gold ingots glittered in the sun, and while the goblins looked at the nightmarish stones with admiration, Jared's retinue could not believe their eyes. True, one of the warriors had a dark thought about driving out the goblins and seizing their rich mines. Meanwhile, the creatures danced joyfully with the stones from the nightmare forest, inviting their allies to the party. Ibaneba suddenly called out to someone who seemed to be still hiding in the forest, watching everyone. Tall creatures with weapons and in powerful armor appeared from behind the trees. They were dark elves, but it was not yet clear why they were here. The king thought, "Red goblins, although they often avoid people, are not withdrawn. They are on good terms with the dark elves, with whom they even have a signed agreement. This also applies to other creatures. Therefore, if the army of Civia attacked the goblins, many would stand up for them. It was already dark outside. Jared and Isabella were sitting by the fire, resting after an exhausting day. Isabella kept trying to find out how the king managed to find out about the value of the nightmare stone for the goblins. All the creatures that arrived at the clearing, together with the army of Civia, were having a good time. Some were drinking drinks, while others decided to take part in a sparring match with the dark elves. Jared called Lakis over. He was concerned about the kingdom's workshops that made weapons. They had been short of raw materials for a long time, so the king ordered that all the iron they received today be sent to them. Lakis bowed his head obediently, listening to the order. Jared also intended to invest some of the gold into the army, and wanted Lakis to organize a military draft. Having overheard their conversation, Ibanaba, as if by chance, asked about their intentions to fight with Mallorca. The Goblin King understood that they needed such a quantity of resources for a reason. While he devoured the grapes, he supported the plan of the dumbfounded Jared. Mallorca had long been a place where evil flourished. Jared was worried that Ibanaba would be angry when he learned that his resources were going to the war. But fortunately, this did not happen. The king put his hand on the shoulder of the king of Civia. He himself did not support Horus, so he was not against it. Suddenly, Ibanaba decided to shout a toast in honor of Jared. Glasses of drinks rose into the air, supporting the words of the goblin leader. This attention made Jared a little uneasy, causing him to laugh awkwardly. But when the attention of those around him shifted, his face became much more serious. It was March 14th, 1414. About a month had passed since Isabel's resurrection. Jared introduced her to Hayes, calling her his classmate from Desmond Academy. Isabel quickly settled into the castle and helped Jared practice his defense skills using hallucinations of his fears. It turned out that he was afraid of spiders. It was their illusions that he fought until the defense level increased to level 34. Holding a few candies in her hand, Isabel tried to understand why Jared gave them to her. She even suggested that the king wanted her to get fat, but he was quick to explain. The thing is that today was a special day on which, according to custom, men gave candy to women. Isabel still didn't understand what was going on. She tilted her head and looked at Jared suspiciously. When the gist of the holiday dawned on her, she smiled, playfully twirling a lock of hair around her finger and asking if he liked it. But the king hastened to explain again that he had given sweets to all the girls in the castle. The girl was clearly not satisfied with the answer, but she still ate one lollipop. Isabel noted ironically that he was willing to use her for training, but was in no hurry to share his heart. Throwing herself at the guy, she, smirking, reminded him that they were connected to him by the spiritual eye and the first kiss. But Jared defended himself, glad that the contract they had entered into was not a marriage contract. The king abruptly changed the subject, saying that now it was time to work on strengthening his magic. Isabel didn't mind, informing him that she would put some pressure on him using lust magic. Jared's face twisted in fear, and the guy tried to dissuade her. But Isabel was unstoppable. Still, the training was a success. Jared raised his magic level to 5th grade. Soon, a project was launched to educate capable students who were selected using the spiritual eye. This was an important step to lure young talents to his side in time. The king invested heavily in this project. In accordance with the mutual reward system, Jared also received bonuses for the progress of his students. Isabel was a quick learner, showing results at the forefront. Lena also tried to keep up, successfully completing her training. She was proud that her teacher was King Jared. Mia also gradually mastered magic, perceiving everything more like a game. Jared thought about it. He was glad that his teaching method was working, but it was all going too smoothly. True, this lasted until one moment. Hayes could not allow herself to call the king a teacher. She was clearly too nervous to explain that she was just a servant, although the idea of becoming a healer appealed to her. But her progress was at 0, and this became the fly in the ointment. Healers specialized in treatment, and there were very few of them, no more than 5 on the entire continent. Jared was confused, but quickly realizing what the problem was, he tried to convey to Hayes, not very tactfully, that she shouldn't get too worked up. Hayes had to believe in herself and change internally. Oberyn, supporting the king's thoughts, agreed. He understood that Hayes had been a servant since childhood, and she did not see herself in any other role. Jared continued to think. Obviously, something was holding her back. She didn't believe in herself. He was concerned about what he could do to help her get rid of her internal blocks. Oberyn looked down, listening intently. Putting the cup back on the saucer, he turned to the king again. The gentleman believed that many owed their happiness to the king, and that perhaps now he just needed to believe in her. Jared could only believe in Hayes. Even though she wasn't succeeding at everything yet, she was sincerely trying. His eyes lit up again as a plan formed in his head. Having thanked Oberyn, he flew out of the office. The boy ran quickly down the hallway. Now he understood what Hayes needed in order to open up. Suddenly, a man in a mask appeared behind him with a weapon in his hands. Seeing the king lying unconscious on the floor, Hayes rushed towards him. Jared looked bad. The frightened maid did not understand what had happened. The guards told her that the king had been attacked. Tears welled up in the girl's eyes as she looked at Jared in horror. Although the doctor had already been called, the frightened Hayes knew that she had to at least try to help. He taught her how to heal, after all. Leaning over the king, Hayes began to provide assistance. Crying, unable to calm down, she begged him to hold on a little longer. A green magical glow appeared near her hands, and she began the healing process. Hayes couldn't afford to screw up. She had decided long ago that she would help him no matter what. The size of the magical currents increased, concentrating around Jared. Half an hour later, Hayes was scolding the guard, the king, and the pseudo-attacker for the scene they had played out. Although the girl still hadn't recovered from the shock, it worked. Still crying, she didn't stop being indignant. Hayes was very scared for the king, but he hastened to console her, at least by saying that the wounds were not real. Trying to change the subject, he asked the girl what it was like to be a healer, to which she replied that it was terrible. She continued to scold the pseudo-attacker and the guard as they bowed their heads and awkwardly apologized. The girl ran away in tears, unable to cope with her emotions, despite the king's attempts to calm her down. Oberyn, standing behind, cleared his throat and clarified that he didn't mean exactly those methods, which made it even more awkward. Lacus made his way through the forest, engulfed in a snowstorm. Seeing the light from the lantern, the man tensed up, trying to understand who was approaching him. The unexpected stranger turned out to be an acquaintance of Lacus, Mr. Orson, a grown man with a gray beard. He led Lacus into his hut and gave him some hot tea. Orson clearly perceived the head of security as a child, calling him a baby every now and then. Having lit the fireplace, Orson inquired about the reasons why Lacus was wandering through the forest. While avoiding a direct answer, Lacus said that he had thought about him and had brought something as a gift. From his bag, he took out a bottle of medicine from Renel, clarifying that this was now a necessary thing for a hunter. Orson had heard about this medicine. The man was interested in how such a terrible king could create it. Lacus, no longer hiding the reasons for his presence in the forest, finally admitted that the king had sent him. Jared wanted him to find Orson and convince him to come back. The hunter laughed. After the king had abandoned him, he could hardly expect Orson to return. But Lacus did not give in. He understood how important it was to persuade Orson, because experienced warriors were now very much needed in Civia. He promised the hunter that he would change his mind when he saw how the state had flourished. The territory of the continent was engulfed in wars of conquest that took the lives of many people. There was no mercy for anyone, whether you were a common man or a well-connected monarch. Fear took hold of everyone, but it seemed that the trip to the northern edge was salvation. Placing the beer on the table, Jared said with a smile that it was quite cool in Civia. He proudly noted that due to the proximity to the sea, seafood is cheaper here than in other lands. Isabel asked skeptically if that meant that nothing would grow in this cold. Jared, smiling awkwardly, confirmed the girl's guess. All hope now lay in their pesticides. Hayes, in an attempt to cheer the king up a little, stated her confidence in the pesticides he had produced. At the next table, men were discussing how the region had begun to develop. Everything had changed for the better, starting with the roads. They were hunters, and they were clearly pleased with such privileges of Civia as the cure for Renel. Having heard the hunters' conversation, the boys were delighted. They were seriously considering moving their headquarters to this region. Isabel even came to the conclusion that their trip to explore the village had not been pointless. Noticing that the king was staring intently at one point, the girl tried to find out what he was staring at. Not far from them, there was a red-haired lady with a decent bust. She was loud, so the whole bar could hear how happy she was with the local beer. Jared recognized her as Ella, the sword warrior. This character, for a fee, helped the main character. He remembered her from the time when he played Paradis, being a simple man. Ella was a cool character overall. The only thing was that she didn't care who she helped, as long as they paid her. The king also recognized the girl who sat next to Ella. With his spiritual eye, he considered her characteristics. Chloe was the queen of silence. Jared was surprised to meet her in such a place. He remembered that during the War of the Host, she would become the queen of the Dark Elves. His interest grew because Ella and Chloe, and together, became unexpected guests of the northern region for him. Too many questions were spinning in his head, and he couldn't wait any longer. The king, jumping, rushed to the table of the warrior and the queen of silence. Ella watched him through her tinted glasses in surprise. When he finally approached the table, the warrior tried to brush him off. She was already 32, she wasn't interested in small ones. Jared, 25, was stunned by her reaction. He would not survive this shame. Concerned, Hayes rushed to him. The girl indignantly addressed the culprits of the incident. She stated that this was not just anyone in front of them, but the king of Civia, so they should be more polite. After her words, everyone in the bar fell silent, digesting what they had heard. But this quickly turned into discussions about what the king could be doing in such a place. Ella was clearly irritated. Standing up, she reminded Hayes that the maids could not speak in such a tone. But the girl was not just a simple servant either. She also now held the high position of a healer. The bickering further enraged the warrior, who looked down at Hayes with a scorching gaze. Fortunately, Jared finally came to his senses and diffused the situation by asking Ella for a favor. Hugging Hayes, he clarified that although their meeting had been strange, he was still willing to pay for the future service. Ella softened. Agreeing that the first meeting had not been the best, she apologized for her rudeness. Looking around the room, the king realized that all eyes were still on them and suggested changing seats. In a secluded room, Jared offered Ella to mentor one of his charges for 5,000 gold. Squinting happily in anticipation of a successful deal, the king added about the need to sign the agreement. Chloe, who sat on Ella's right side, was ready to submit to any decision she made as a mentor. After thinking for a moment, the warrior asked if Jared trusted her, since they barely knew each other. The king answered honestly that he did not trust them, but he was ready to trust those he would pay. Jared remembered well how much Ella loved money, especially such huge sums as 5,000 gold. This will be her undoing in the future, when she does not receive recognition from the heroes. But now she seemed to be pleased with the king's answer and offer. Now she was eager to get down to business and meet her new student in person. Chloe listened calmly to their conversation, sipping her tea and no longer interfering in the discussion of the deal. Night fell. Jared was still happy that he had finally found a worthy teacher for Lena. And although it was already quite late, Gorzes's necklace allowed him to remain alert. The king was tormented by the fact that he had forgotten a lot of information about the game that he knew by heart in his past life. He barely even remembered Chloe today. The kingdom's rapid progress made it difficult to keep records of it. However, he wanted to leave at least some of his knowledge on paper. Jared used Korean so that others who found the book would not be able to read it. It was an important work that contained all his knowledge about this world of the game Paradise. Already in the morning, Lena, together with Chloe, began training under Ella's guidance. The girl puffed, trying to drag the log. Jared stood next to the warrior, watching the process. The training looked very tough. In his head, there even arose hope that Lena would not become a pumped-up monster. He also noticed that Chloe, unlike the girl, didn't look like she was straining herself too much. The elf was calm and restrained in her emotions even now. Ella noted that Lena is talented, but she is not the only one. Although the warrior didn't know who had taught Lena before, she realized from the results that the teacher was so-so. Jared smiled awkwardly, mentally feeling sorry for Lakes. According to Ella, she could deal with him in a couple of seconds. Despite her past failures, Ella noticed that the girl was learning quickly with the help of magical equipment. The training method Jared developed was very effective. Lena, hiding behind a shield, had to avoid being hit by 4 homing elemental spells. This training was supposed to help her learn how to handle protective equipment. When Ella asked about his training method, the king lied and said that it was a practice from the eastern continent. In fact, it was another bug that the king used for the benefit of Lena's development. He knew that the system reduced experience per repetition, but with 4 items it considered the training different. In this way, he managed to bypass the anti-macros type of training system. Jared looked at Ella, shocked that she could read Lena's condition without having the spiritual eye. Now, he was at peace with his choice of teacher for young Lena, who continued to run around with a shield. In the agricultural sector, work was also in full swing. Mr. Oberon arrived at one of the fields during sowing to find out if everything was going according to plan. The fields were filled with vegetation. Once the pests had been eradicated, things were going well. One of the farmers happily reported that in Renel, where the pests had migrated, they now wanted to know about their method. People rejoiced because new approaches to growing plant-based food had led to success. Farmers thanked Oberon. Mr. Oberon also thanked them, causing several people to shed tears. The system notified that the kingdom has entered the Golden Age. Now production will receive bonuses. The people loved their king more and more, which brought him additional loyalty points. Everyone was in their place. Hayes helped with important matters. Lena continued training, and Jared, after all his efforts, finally got his way. Reading the notice about the Golden Age, he was overcome with delight. Akron wandered the streets of Civia. Although he had not heard much about the prosperity of this state, the views were impressive. Arriving before the king, he bowed in respect, greeting Jared. Introducing himself, he said that he had a message. Having scanned him with the spiritual eye, Jared had no doubts left. He was facing an ill-wisher. The icons also told him that Akron was a level 4 mage. By defeating him, the king could gain a lot of wisdom points. But, pretending to know nothing, Jared greeted Akron happily in return. When Jared asked him if the king of Majorca was pleased with the size of the tribute from Civia, he received a flattering answer. On the other hand, Akron's answer clearly indicated that he considered Majorca to be of higher status than Civia. Although this infuriated Jared, from the outside it seemed that everything was fine. Lakes watched them from the side. Still, he was interested in the message that Akron had to convey. The magician took out a letter written personally by Horgus and handed it to Jared. The letter spoke of Horgus's desire to improve relations with Civia despite all the disagreements in the past. Jared said out loud that he would be glad for this, but inside he was seething with anger. Horgus had clearly underestimated him. He told Akron that he would soon send Majorca the finest Civia crystals as a token of friendship. Akron smiled when he heard this and said that Horgus would be very happy about it. Finally, Jared added that Civia is always happy to welcome such guests. Having gone hunting, the king immediately noticed a deer, which stood surrounded by trees. Jared took careful aim with his bow. The released arrow hit the animal straight. The guards immediately reported that the king had hit the target. The accompanying retinue clapped their hands, praising Jared. Basking in the rays of glory, the king happily waved his hand to the pleased crowd. Lacus, standing a little behind, came closer to ask why he was so polite to the bastards from Majorca. Jared explained to him that there would be a conflict in any case, and in such a case, it would be better not to be in the role of the aggressor. Lacus was amazed by his insight. By hiding his true intentions, one can outwit the enemy. The king put his index finger to his lips, hinting to Lacus that this conversation should not be conducted so loudly. As Jared left the forest, he convinced Lacus that it was better to strike last, without being too humbled by flattery. Turning to the others, the king joyfully proposed to throw a feast in honor of the development of their land. This proposal met with an expectedly positive reaction. It was already dark outside. Everyone around was having fun. Some were drinking beer, others were eating chicken legs. Jared was relaxing in the company of Lacus, not forgetting to ask him if he was very worried about the upcoming war. The head of security assured him that everything was fine. He liked to hope that the golden age had finally arrived for Civia. Among the company, there was a man who was clearly not in a friendly mood. He tilted his head, smiling wryly at the thought of Jared's apparent carelessness. Holding the stack of firewood tightly on his back, the man rose from his seat. As he walked away from everyone, he was glad that soon the king of Civia would be drinking not beer, but his own blood. Jared seemed to understand what the man's intentions were here. The spiritual eye helped to recognize him as a spy. Although the presence of spies did not come as a surprise to the king, he knew that as soon as the spy delivered the information to Horus, Majorca would start a war, without even suspecting who she was dealing with. The fun was coming to an end. But for Jared, who had clearly had too much to drink, the fun ended a little earlier. A month later, on April 29th, 14144, early in the morning, Majorca began a war against Civia. The enemy army, having saddled their horses, rushed towards Civia at full speed. Horus, who led the army, led an army ready to destroy everything in its path. And, first of all, Civia. The palace rooms of the Civian castle were empty. There was not a soul in them. This made Lena a little nervous. The girl turned to Chloe, who was standing next to her, asking if she knew where everyone had gone. Suddenly, Lena heard Ella's voice over her ear, who was unhappy with the girl's conversations during training. After that, an order was given. Now Lena had to run a cross-country race, which she began to do at the same second. Ella knew war was coming. She was pretty annoyed that Jared didn't warn her about it. Stretching, she wondered if he thought she shouldn't interfere. A fireball suddenly appeared in the clear sky. The shell hit the watchtower, sending the soldier standing there flying in the opposite direction. The quiet day was suddenly filled with the cries of warriors. The attack had begun. They were retreating from their positions. The enemy army reported to Horus about the destruction of the tower, asking whether it was necessary to organize a pursuit detachment. The king of Majorca refused. There was no need, he thought, since the Civian army consisted of only one battalion. Feeling the victory coming soon, Horus even regretted that he had not captured Civia earlier. He expected that everything would be so easy. The enemy army began to pillage, while the king of Majorca mocked Jared. Raising his sword to the sky, he ordered the warriors to take everything they could, because now no one could stop them. Meanwhile, the local population was evacuated. People forced to leave their homes took only the most valuable things. There was a feeling of fear and terrible helplessness in the air. But, as some believed, it was their king who was in the worst situation now. Jared listened to the news from a soldier reporting that the enemy had broken through the fourth line of defense. The soldier also reported that the enemy was advancing quickly and would be here soon. Jared looked worriedly into the distance, where the silhouettes of the major's army were already visible. He needed to speed up. Turning to Lacus, the king ordered that the place where they were now located be held with all their might. Otherwise, the escape route will be closed. Turning his head, the king noticed Hayes quickly heading his way. Running to Jared, Hayes immediately began to beg him to take her with him to the battlefield. The king rejected her request. It was too dangerous. He could not risk the girl like that. But Hayes didn't back down. As a healer, she knew she would be useful on the battlefield. Her abilities were truly unique and useful. Healers are indispensable during war. But taking the girl's hand in his, Jared still insisted on his own. He could not let her die. Tears welled up in her eyes. Hayes didn't want to sit by while the king was in danger. Jared, even more gently than before, tried to convey to Hayes that he was very afraid of losing someone close to him. They were together from the very beginning. Memories of their childhood came to mind. Even then, Jared and Hayes got along and began to help each other. Moreover, even from the cradle, the future king was prepared for a possible war. So now he's ready to protect those he cares about. Jared asked Hayes to trust him. And still holding her hand in his, the girl agreed, accepting his care. The touching moment clearly did not impress Isabella, who was watching them from the side. Coming closer, she grabbed Hayes by the collar, dragging her away and saying that the healer should be in the rear. Jared watched the scene awkwardly, waving at the girls. Having put on his helmet, the king was finally ready. It's time to fight back against Horgus's army. The positions occupied by the Crivian army gave them a geographical advantage. But the problem of the army's size did not go away. The commander had only 300 men at his disposal, and although many of them had talent, it was still not enough. Lacus drooped a little. Among the militia were also hundreds of farmers who had no combat experience or training. Bowing his head in thought, he prepared to make a speech. And so, standing before the army, he began with gratitude to all those who were now here on the battlefield. Lacus sincerely regretted that simple farmers had to fight, but there was no choice. Continuing his speech, he reminded them that despite their desire for peace with Mallorca, in order to survive, they would have to fight back. Meanwhile, Horgus rode his horse towards their location, leading an army of more than 200 warriors. Knowing this, Lacus suggested that those who were not ready to face them leave the battlefield without fear of being judged. Memories from the past washed over him. He remembered how one man had tried to dissuade him from the idea of staying in Civia after the death of the previous king. At that time, no one had any hope that Jared would be able to ensure even survival during the harsh winters. But Lacus didn't leave. He stayed. Even after he was stripped of his post, he was not ready to leave Civia. Then he preferred to die with her, rather than run away as far as possible. The man never understood this decision, and, not wanting to have anything to do with Lacus anymore, he left him. And now, when he was again ready to do anything for Civia, the crowd supported him. The farmers were filled with a fighting spirit and were ready to fight for their land. Their spirits were also supported by the king's recent reforms, which allowed Civia to finally flourish. Lacus couldn't believe his ears. The farmers, as one, shouted that they would rather die than surrender to a traitorous state. Remembering the words of that man from the past about the cold winter, Lacus suddenly realized that he was wrong. Now, on the contrary, he was practically glowing. After the order was given to issue armor to the farmers, one of the soldiers came running with the news. The enemy army was approaching, but the soldier had another unpleasant piece of news. It was not the army of Horgus that was approaching them, but the army of King Renel. He led his army, wanting, like the king of Mallorca, to crush Civia. A month earlier, Horgus and the king of Renel met for negotiations. The king of Majorca was interested in the question of whether Lord Renel had received tribute from Civia. He answered in the affirmative. Moreover, the tribute received was enormous, apparently in order to maintain friendly relations. Hearing this, Horgus slammed his fist on the table. He was furious with Jared and his political activities. He suspected that the king of Civia had not just become friendly after a long period of coldness in their relations. Jared managed to attract 20% of their hunters, who eventually migrated to Civia. Horgus was sure that Jared wanted to touch their territory. He also thought that the king of Civia was simply scared, because despite the prosperity of the kingdom, it was still weak. Trying to prove to the king of Renel that Jared was trying to buy peace with money, he made his interlocutor think. To prove his words, Horgus reported that the number of Civia's troops was only 300 soldiers. The king of Renel was stunned by these numbers. He could not believe that Jared's army was so small. Horgus, continuing to prove his case, stated that it was this fact that made Jared try to buy peace with gold. Twirling the coin in his hand, he also added that Jared, having offered a large sum, would be naive to think that they would not attack him. Horgus also informed his interlocutor that he had sent his scout mage Akron to Civia in order to strengthen the alliance. Hearing this, the king of Renel jumped up from his seat. He did not expect to hear about a truce between the states, but Horgus, smiling slyly, added that from that day on they would prepare for war against Civia. Having estimated that a month would be enough to prepare, the king of Majorca declared that after this period they would attack. And then, jumping up from his seat, he proposed the creation of a united front with the king of Renel. He, in turn, enthusiastically agreed. Having sealed the alliance treaty, they shook hands. The combined strength of their forces exceeded 3,000 soldiers. It seemed that the kings had a common goal and would become staunch allies. But, in fact, given the opportunity, they were ready to crush each other, without a single doubt. And now, having arrived on the battlefield, the king of Renel could only guess how angry Jared was with their alliance. He was confident of victory, already thinking about how he would defeat the king of Civia. The king of Renel was confident that he could not be stopped, which I told him when I finally approached Jared. For while they were speaking, the enemy allied armies surrounded the lands of Civia. The king of Renel and his army reached them by a bypass road that the Civians had ignored. And now, being here, he told Jared to say goodbye to his possessions and lives. He was already ready to watch as the king of Civia crawled on his knees to beg for mercy. Without making any reaction, Jared simply looked at his confident opponent. But when he took off his helmet, he left everyone around him stunned with surprise. The opponents couldn't believe their eyes. It wasn't Jared, but some guy they didn't know who was pretending to be the king. The spy sent into the Civian army tried to digest what he saw. He did not understand where the real king had gone. Without wasting any more time, he rushed at full speed to report to his king what had happened. The spy realized that they had been tricked. The situation that had developed was bad. But now all he had to do was report the trap to his patron. Suddenly, one of the Civian army appeared in front of him, striking him in the face. After such a blow, the spy even lost several teeth. Putting a dagger to his throat, the second soldier was convinced that there really was a spy in front of him. In response, he received a mocking reproach from the first soldier. As the head of order, he reacted with too much surprise. The green-haired man, responding to the mockery, noted that in front of them was a spy who had opened the way for Renel to attack. All the information he had gathered turned out to be false. Now the soldiers were going to finish off the spy once and for all. Jared and Lakis learned of the alliance of the enemy kingdoms before the war. Then, in the silence of the night, they discussed the matter. Jared assumed that the enemy would choose the main road for attack, but Lakis corrected him, speaking of several possible options. On the one hand, the main road is a good place for an ambush. But, on the other hand, there is a great risk of losing many soldiers while the enemy occupies the high ground. Jared agreed. Their geographical superiority was no secret. The enemy had clearly taken that into account. That is why Horgus and the king of Renel expectedly began to search for a workaround, and, in the end, they found it. Jared had foreseen this. He knew that there was an enemy spy among them who would help the enemy find the way. By posing as a lumberjack, the spy could carefully study the bypass route. Therefore, the king of Civia decided to place a trap, in the form of a mine, in a nook. Lacus looked at the mine Jared had developed in surprise. It was the first time the man had seen something like that. And, after asking to know how the weapon worked, the king agreed to demonstrate, asking Lacus to stand behind him. Even more surprised by the king's request, Lacus complied, after which Jared got down to business. By sending a magical flow along the thread that led to the mine, he started the process. The purple crystal that was located in the center of the mine began to glow, and suddenly, a few moments later, there was a powerful explosion. The mine shattered into thousands of tiny pieces, damaging everything in its path. Jared and Lacus remained unharmed only because the king put a magical shield in front of them in time. The astonished security chief couldn't believe his eyes. It was a weapon of astonishing power. With this weapon, the king will be able to defeat the enemy in the forest and save the city from destruction. The bypass route will become their grave. And now, sometime after the conversation, being in ambush, Jared was ready to put this plan into action. Horgus's army raced along the bypass path. Akron was right behind the king, keeping pace. Burning with bloodlust, Horgus gave the order to dismember anyone who dared to resist. He ordered those Crivians who surrendered to be put in chains. The army was already anticipating a great victory and the riches that would be obtained after it. And, as if to further provoke the army to decisive cruelty, Horgus announced the beginning of the massacre. Suddenly, after this, Jared's voice was heard, which confirmed that there would now be a massacre. Horgus was stunned by surprise. Jared continued, noting that Horgus was wrong. His soldiers were more concerned with raising their shields than their weapons right now. Holding the threads from the mines in his hands, the king of Civia sent a magical flow through them, starting a chain reaction. There were less than a few seconds left before the mines buried underground would detonate. Sensing something was wrong, Horgus and his army rushed forward, trying to quickly leave the place where death awaited them. Akron felt the ground shake. The mage no longer looked so confident. Now he was overcome with fear. After shouting for the other mages to begin defensive magic, it became clear that their time was up. A huge explosion tore through the earth, destroying all life around. Thousands of small particles from the mines pierced the bodies of the enemy army. Some of the soldiers were engulfed in flames, burning alive. Horgus managed to escape. Akron covered him with a magical shield, saving him from fragments and fire. Smoke filled the area and rose high into the sky. King Renel's army watched this scene from afar. The king panicked. He thought with horror that they were now in a losing situation. But it didn't take long. He came to his senses pretty quickly. Even without the support of Majorca, he had about 1,800 soldiers at his disposal. Raising his sword to the sky, he gave the order to attack. With their spears raised in front of them, Renel's army charged. The Crivian warriors were already preparing for the clash. Hiding behind shields, they fought for their lives. Meanwhile, Horgus, who was wounded in the shoulder, had also already managed to recover from the explosion. Having told Akron that he was fine, the king of Majorca ordered a report on the situation. The magician looked confused. Only 500 soldiers survived, who followed at the end of the column. The rest were dead. The magician and the king were surrounded by many corpses of soldiers and their horses. The flag of Majorca lay smoldering on the ground, damaged by the explosion. The king was horrified when he learned of the losses. The 2 magicians he had hired earlier were also dead. Horgus realized the dire situation he was in. Now the only hope was Akron. He ordered him to stay close to him. But while Horgus was wondering what to do next, Jared lunged at Akron, sending him flying off to the side. The king of Civia clamped his hands around Akron's neck, not allowing him to escape. After a short flight to the side, they suddenly soared upward. Jared sarcastically asked him why he was nervous as they soared higher. And it finally dawned on Akron that the king of Civia had known about their intentions to attack from the very beginning. Now he was interested in something else, when Jared would finally stop flying. Deciding that they were high enough, the king released his fingers from around Akron's neck. The magician flew down at great speed. Jared watched him for a couple of seconds, and then he rushed down, straight for Akron. Forming the ice storm spell in his hands, Jared considered what his opponent would do. There were two options. Either Akron would activate flight to avoid being crushed when falling, or he will create a shield to avoid being harmed by the ice storm. And so Jared attacked. Akron made his choice. He created a shield, shouting that the king of Civia had completely lost his mind. Usually, during a fight, magicians keep a certain distance, testing the opponent's level. And after they understand who is worth what, they begin to attack continuously. This is how duels usually happen. However, usually did not apply to Jared. The king came as close as possible to Akron and embraced him with his arms. The magician from Majorca was at a loss, not understanding what Jared had in mind. After all, so far it looked like he wanted to kill both of them. But suddenly, he noticed a large magic circle that was located below them. A smile appeared on Akron's face. Now he understood what Jared's plan was. As you know, magicians are divided into classes, and it is important to know that the fourth class is a very honorable level. For example, Horus spent a huge amount of money on third-class mages in order to gain strong allies. At the very beginning of his transformation, Jared was very excited about his form. After all, in his best condition, he would have had enough strength to subdue Duca several times. But in the form he was reborn in, using fourth-class magic could only be done once. As for Akron, he was a perfectly balanced fourth-class mage. In terms of magical powers, he was not inferior to Jared, although his fighting skills left much to be desired. Akron, having gained strength, struck back at the king of Civia, who managed to hide behind a shield. But this did not save Jared, because in close combat, the shield is very fragile and easily breaks. The impact shattered his helmet into pieces, and Jared's face twisted in pain. Akron now understood the strategy of the king of Civia. Jared placed the magical portal lower, near the ground. The king planned it so that Akron would have to use a shield to protect himself from his attacks. Therefore, Akron would not have had time to save himself from the fall, and Jared would have flown into the portal. But now he has figured out this plan. Now, after Jared's latest attack, Akron found himself closer to the portal, intending to use it. Jared tried to speed up in flight, realizing that he was trapped. But Akron, in order to not let him get closer, formed a fireball to attack. Now it's time for Jared to choose. Either he stops the attack, or he falls. A huge smile spread across Akron's face. His flames would kill the king. But even a fall could mean death. In any case, Jared had no chance of staying alive. Jared used a magic shield, stopping the attack. Akron watched happily, knowing that even if the king survived the attack, he would not be able to enter the portal after it. But even if Jared had been able to get through the portal, Akron would have immediately destroyed him with his attacks. As he passed through the portal, Akron's face turned to horror. He wasn't teleported. Instead, he fell onto sharp spears sticking out of the tree. A few seconds later, Jared descended towards Akron, gloating that he had not managed to figure him out after all. He went down to the magician in order to tell him everything. Akron's face contorted in horror and confusion. Jared, having thrown a barb at the magician, nevertheless began to explain. Akron made the mistake of attacking the king while he was flying higher, which ended up helping to cushion Jared's fall. The king knew that his ice storm attack would hasten Akron's fall, bringing him closer to the portal. And Jared also deliberately took the enemy's attack, making him the one who had to go through the trap portal first. The king noted that if something seems too good to be true, it most likely is a hoax. When Akron learned that he had been acting at the king's behest all this time, the veins on his face bulged with rage. Not wanting to delay any longer, a flame appeared in the king's hand. It was time to get even with the one who had killed so many innocents. With a powerful attack, he delivered justice. Akron's glasses, the only thing left of him, fell at the king's feet. The completed task added 15 wisdom points to Jared as a reward. Meanwhile, the slaughter between the Renel and Crivian armies continued. Hayes was in the rear, helping the wounded and healing them. And the king of Renella, expecting the imminent collapse of the defense of the Crivian soldiers, encouraged his army. But the Crivians did not give in. They tried to hold the line and fight back against Renella's army. Their main problem now was the center, where the defense had almost been broken through. The soldiers needed reinforcements, but before they could react, the center was broken through by the enemy army. Lacus assessed the situation in horror. The enemies were closing in. They were ordered to ignore the soldiers and kill the common people first. All they cared about was filling their pockets with money after the massacre. The enemy army was approaching the tent, where Hayes and the medics were rescuing the wounded. The frightened girls froze in fear as they saw how Renella's army had almost reached them. Suddenly, something heavy flew at the soldier who was running first. The blow sent him flying back, falling on his back. Those running after him stopped, not understanding what was happening. The man who threw the projectile turned out to be Sir Orson, who had unexpectedly appeared on the battlefield. Another warrior stood next to him. The men discussed how the Crivian army was not the same anymore. Now they understood why the king was so eager to find them after he retired. Lacus, not believing his eyes, asked Orson why he was here now. Sir Orson calmly explained that he would have arrived earlier, but was delayed kicking Mallorca's ass. Now everyone saw that behind the men there was also a large group of armed soldiers. These soldiers are the soldiers of the former leader of Crivia, Barrett. 100 elite warriors were ready to join the ranks of those who would now defend the state. Orson's history of serving the king ended because of Jared. King Jared, even before his rebirth, sent his father's loyal warrior into retirement after the death of the previous king. Being loyal to Crivia, Orson could not simply give up, but the new king was adamant. Barrett was dead, and Jared had no use for his soldiers. So he dismissed all the soldiers who had once served his father. Jared insisted that it was all due to a lack of funds. But in reality, he simply spent all the money on entertainment and a luxurious life. Soon, parasites like Glagus took advantage of the situation. Now, they were in charge. In addition to the dismissal of Barrett's guards, the army also suffered from severe shortfalls in pay. Not wanting to watch the disintegration of Crivia, they went to live in the forest. After Orson's meeting with Lacus, the guard was walking through the forest. It was another ordinary day. Suddenly, he saw a crowd on the horizon, dragging something. Looking closer, Orson realized that they were goblins carrying iron in a cart. Orson prepared for the fight. Seeing a hunter with a weapon who was clearly not in a friendly mood, the goblins became frightened, and, to Orson's surprise, they simply turned around to go around him. The man watched this, not understanding what had just happened. He clearly didn't expect the goblins to simply ignore him. Arriving at the forge, the hunter finally learned the reason for such calm behavior of these creatures. The blacksmith explained to him that the goblins supplied them with resources, thanks to which they made tons of weapons. After Jared's reforms, the robot in the forge was boiling non-stop. Orson wondered if this was tiring for the artisans. The answer was obvious. Naturally, they were tired, but they were happy. Thanks to the king, the blacksmiths were back in their place, constantly engaged in their favorite craft. Orson was amazed. Lacus was right. The reforms were gradually getting Crivia back on its feet. Realizing this, the soldiers who left returned to duty. Now they are ready to give the king a second chance. These warriors are the best of the best. And now they are ready to fight for Crivia, following Jared. More than the battle was covered in blood. The enemy armies failed. They were no match for the experience and skill of Barrett's soldiers. They couldn't even look them in the eye. The enemies begged for mercy, and some quickly retreated. King Renel's army was clearly displeased. Their king had not foreseen the traps and miscalculated his forces. Now the king of Renel regretted the alliance. Now they had no choice but to retreat. Meanwhile, Horgus and his army also tried to escape from the battlefield. But Jared clearly had no intention of letting them go as he pursued the enemy army. Flying up to Horgus's ear, the guy sarcastically asked if he was okay. Horgus tried to strike with his sword, but was too late. Jared had already managed to fly higher, thinking out loud that the king of Mallorca was weak. Horgus looked up at him. Unable to bear it any longer, he shouted for Jared to come down, and they could finally fight like men. Jared smiled. He accepted the challenge. A huge fireball appeared behind him. Soon, the king of Mallorca was already engulfed in flames. The remaining soldiers rushed to the aid of the king, but the attempt was not successful. Almost immediately, their body was pierced by magical attacks. An angry Jared ordered them to back off. The soldiers froze, waiting to see what would happen next. Horgus, coughing, rose to his feet. Jared approached him while simultaneously telling him that he knew peace between them was impossible. Horgus couldn't believe it. Gritting his teeth in anger, he digested what he heard. Suddenly, a magical beam struck his face, causing his helmet to fly apart in all directions. The king of Mallorca fell to his knees, catching his breath after the blow. But the subsequent magical attacks were not long in coming, soon piercing Horgus's body. Jared was determined. He could not allow anyone else to suffer from the actions of the king of Mallorca. The faces of all those who, before his eyes, had experienced the pain and horror of this monster flashed through his mind. The attacks grew stronger and stronger. Jared wanted to clear the lands of Horgus. The king of Mallorca, although physically injured, was clearly not broken morally. He turned to Jared, asking if he really believed he could fix things. But the king of Civia knew very well about past mistakes and was ready to correct everything. But before him was a much more cruel man, who was much worse even than his previous version before reincarnation. With a quick movement, he plunged the blade into Horgus's leg. He howled in pain. Jared did this in order to finally calm his opponent down. But Horgus did not stop. He believed that even after his death, nothing would change. He consoled himself with the hope that the general of the knights, having learned of his death, would come to avenge him. Jared reached into his pocket for his book of notes on the world of this game. Opening it, he found information about Count Byrox, with whom Horgus had just threatened him. The king of Majorca was taken aback, not understanding how Jared knew the count's name. The guy explained that it was all about his notes on people and events. He spent a lot of time on these notes, and it was while he was writing them that he learned that Horgus and the count were related. Suddenly, Jared let out a chuckle. He found it funny that Horgus had hoped that the count would take revenge and kill him. His face suddenly became serious. His question about whether Horgus really had hopes for him sounded like a mockery. After all, to take revenge, the count would have to travel about 5,000 kilometers, crossing the borders of 4 kingdoms. It was simply impossible to overcome this path. Moreover, Jared did not believe that the count would grieve for his nephew very much. The king of Civia continued his monologue, declaring that to him, Horgus was nothing but an eyesore. Horgus turned white at what he heard. Looking down at the king of Mallorca, Jared seemed unwilling to stop his moral torture. A smile appeared on the boy's face as he told Horgus that his life was worthless. After that, magical energy began to glow in his hand again. Within moments, a storm of magical currents was swirling around them. Horgus lowered his head, looking completely broken. Jared decided to give him the chance to say the last words. Hearing this, Horgus became furious. Suddenly, jumping up to attack with a blade in his hands, he shouted at Jared with the order to back off. But his attempt failed. The magical currents caught him before he could harm the king of Civia. Jared's magic enveloped his body, causing him to scream in pain. Horgus couldn't even move from his spot. Now he was definitely in a hopeless situation. Jared, having responded to his order with a barb, was now ready to finally finish what he had started. Soon, Horgus, literally crumbling, was finally defeated. As a reward, the system granted Jared charisma points and increased the value of his territories by 50%. The king fell down. All these fights had exhausted him considerably. Horgus's army still stood around, watching Jared. But as soon as the king of Civia turned an irritated glance at them, they raised their hands up. They gave up. The remaining soldiers at other points of contact also surrendered. After Crivia's victory, Jared did not stop. Disguised in Akron's garb, he set out on his journey. He was accompanied by an army and, of course, Lakis, who was dressed in the armor of Horgus. Initially, he planned not only to recapture Civia, he also wanted to capture Majorca and Renelia. As a result, Majorca fell. The change of power took place in one day. As Jared studied Majorca's numbers, he was content to think that Civia was now free. She was no longer under control. Lakis appeared behind him, interrupting his thoughts with his question about the king's future plans. Lakis also informed Jared that Renelia had no fortresses or troops left, making her an easy target. Nodding, the king of Civia agreed, understanding what Lakis was getting at. Now they planned to go to Renelia, but the king's plan was thwarted, and it was thwarted by one man who appeared quite unexpectedly. Jared had the chance to meet him and the king of Renelia in the reception room on the territory of the second. The man was General Capro of Myceria, smiling as he stated the fact that Horgus had been defeated by Jared. He also added about Jared's conquest of Majorca, and concluded that the reason for the war had now disappeared. The king of Civia frowned, stating that he had a different opinion on the matter before turning his gaze to glare at Renel. After all, the instigator of the war was not only Horgus, but also the monarch sitting next to him. Renel then took refuge from Jared's hints, but still pulled himself together and, clearing his throat, turned to Capra. Capre, sensing what Jared was getting at, agreed that he should be punished in the form of monetary compensation. Renel drooped again as he listened to his sentence. But Jared clearly wasn't happy with this. His eyes turned red. He understood that Capre's peacefulness was a show, behind which was hidden the desire to obtain Renel's territory. But the general, pretending not to notice Jared's reaction, continued to negotiate with Renel about payments. This was the last straw. The king of Civia jumped up from his seat, forming magical energy in his hands to attack. A moment later, an ice storm flew towards Renel. Behind her, Jared attacked with fire arrows. And finally, he formed a fireball. That one, like the rest of the attacks, flew at Renel, causing a powerful explosion of flame behind it. The room was filled with thick smoke. Capre, drawing his sword, walked towards Jared, and, having struck, he hoped that this would bring him to his senses. Jared knew there was no point in further attacking Renel, who was an impenetrable B-rank tank. Capre, putting on a fake smile, asked Jared again if he would agree to compensation from Renel. There was no point in fighting any further. Jared knew that he was facing the leader of the Central Territories with a huge army. Having finally agreed to Capre's terms, the king of Civia thought about the fact that he would still have to fight him anyway. To get from the north to the center, you will have to fight Myceria. Jared promised himself that he would definitely kill Capre. One night in Civia, an important conversation took place. Lena was already sleeping peacefully in her bed. But there were also those who were just starting the evening. Sitting on the veranda with a glass of wine, Ella enjoyed the moment. An unexpected guest distracted her from the process. Chloe, as it turned out, was also not sleeping and went out to get some air. Sitting down next to Ella, she was immediately bombarded with questions about her recent absent-mindedness. Chloe explained that she just couldn't understand why Jared didn't ask Ella for help when the war started. Ella believed that the king of Civia simply did not want to worry the guests, and he invited her exclusively to teach Lena. But Chloe still had doubts. Civia was about to fall. Ella, without looking up from her wine, assured the elf that Jared had apparently been preparing for this for a long time. The elf confirmed. Even at their first meeting, it seemed to her that the king of Civia seemed to know the future. During breaks between training sessions, they often had the opportunity to talk face to face. Then Jared asked her why she was not in the safe territories for the Grey Elves. But here, even then, she was confused by his knowledge. He, for some unknown reason, knew everything. Jared even knew about her father's death at the hands of the orcs. Ella was dumbfounded when she heard this. No one knew about this except the Grey Elves. Chloe continued speaking, adding that the king of Civia even gave her advice. He said that you shouldn't spend your life just looking for revenge. You should look broader. Ella was even more interested. Now they both wanted to know more about Jared and his abilities. Getting up from the table, the warrior suggested that Chloe keep an eye on him, to which the elf agreed. Ella's words, asking to let her know when Chloe began to feel something too, pulled her out of her thoughts about the king. Realizing what the warrior was getting at, Chloe looked at her with displeasure. But she was already on her own wave, carried away by the thought of inviting Jared to share a bottle of wine with her. Chloe was no longer surprised why there were so many dirty rumors about Ella. In Majorca, in a back alley, important conversations were also taking place. The man, clearly not happy with Horgus's loss, threw the bottle at the wall in anger. Surrounded by his guards, he still did not calm down. Horgus's defeat terrified him. He spent a lot of money on it, and now it's all gone to waste. Having ordered the guards to pack their things, the man jumped up from his seat. He intended to leave Majorca as soon as possible. As he walked out into the street, accompanied by a guard, he considered his next steps. The first step was to hide in Renelia. Suddenly, the guard froze. Trying to warn the captain about what he had seen, he looked at the unexpected guests with horror. Captain Prua understood everything without looking. He didn't have time. Jared found him first. With a smile on his face and his comrades behind him, the king of Civia greeted Prua. Jared's eye turned red as it scanned the captain. Prua, trying to appear casual, said he had found a new job and was about to leave. In his hand he clutched a watch, an artifact that could bend space. The king of Civia reacted quickly, directing magical attacks towards the captain. Prua, quickly realizing what to do next, activated the artifact. The clock swung open and the gears began to move. Jared's magical attacks suddenly stopped before reaching their target. Lakis was shocked by what he saw. He thought that a magician was in front of them, but he was wrong. It was all about the artifact, which was capable of stopping magic at a distance of 20 meters from itself. The loophole could be that the artifact was useless against 5th-class magic, but Jared was still a mage 1 level below. The only option was to get to Prua at a distance of less than 20 meters, where the artifact's effect did not spread. Jared walked towards the man who was watching him in surprise. The king said that Prua, the head of the drug cartel, does not have much time left, to which he responded with irony. His fingers closed, and Prua proposed to Jared. He was ready to pay him 3 times more than he paid Horgus for turning a blind eye to them. Prua would prefer to resolve this conflict in this way, but Jared knew he couldn't let him go, or the northern region would fall under Detrakar's control. In the future, Lena would have sided with evil, just like Prua. If he spares him, the man will become the right hand of the Demon King's advisor, and this cannot be allowed. Jared finally gave his answer to the drug dealer's offer, without deviating from his original goal of finishing him off. Prua, hearing this, drew his weapon. His face was like that of a madman. Now Prua was determined in his desire to kill the king. But Jared didn't come empty-handed either. A magical bracelet artifact sparkled on his arm. This bracelet, taken from Duca, allowed you to double your strength and wisdom, provided that your enemy was stronger. And these conditions were met. The artifact was activated. Prua's mood quickly changed when he saw the bracelet in action. The king of Civia was enveloped in a black and purple magical energy, enhancing his abilities. Jared's guards and Prua were already fighting in full force, and the king, also not waiting any longer, soared into the air and launched a series of attacks. Prua, dodging, rushed towards him. The sword in his hands was not simple. Using the power of speed, Prua managed to repel several attacks in a row with the blade. Pushing off the ground, Prua, in a running start, rushed towards Jared. But suddenly, one of the Crivian soldiers appeared in front of him, who did not want Prua to get to the king. Jared tried in horror to order him to get away from the dangerous enemy, but it was too late. Prua, with one blow of his sword, cut the warrior's shield into two parts. And while he was trying to figure out what was going on, a piece of debris fell on his head, stunning the poor man. There were no more barriers between Jared and Prua. The king fired a flash, blinding the drug dealer. And while he was trying to hide from the sudden bright light, Jared attacked. When the flash finally disappeared, the first thing Prua saw were the magical attacks that were already a centimeter away from him. The man quickly jumped back, avoiding most of the potential damage. Now he tried to quickly analyze the situation. Prua understood that before him was a magician who knew how to cope with hand-to-hand combat, and his magical power turned out to be quite fast. After some thought, Prua suspected that Jared was a 5th-class mage, and this was equivalent to fighting 4 Akrons at once. The king's clapping of his hands interrupted his thoughts. Jared claimed he had figured him out. Prua was Ko's sword master, but the king was still surprised that he could not sense the enemy's artifacts, and the black glow emanating from the sword indicated that it was created to fight magic. Jared dropped to the ground. The fact that Prua was carrying a sword meant that he was quite weak, and his watch, for those who arrived within a radius of 20 meters, was no more dangerous than a trinket. Prua was furious as he listened to the king read out all his secret techniques and tricks. He rushed towards the king again, trying to attack him with his sword. Jared rose into the air again and threw a fireball at his opponent. Prua's sword of speed managed to cut through the attack, but Jared had already managed to disappear around the corner. The drug dealer gave chase. Jared flew down a narrow street, releasing magical beams into the walls of nearby stone houses, thereby destroying them. Trying to hide from the falling boulders, Prua jumped lightning fast from one point to another, and, having overcome the danger, he set off in pursuit again. Soon, having caught up with Jared, he tried to cut him with a swing of his sword. But this time, he failed again. Prua did not believe that even using the blink, he failed again. Jared, having soared to a decent height, addressed the enemy. Prua's speed was astonishing, and in order to avoid the blow, the king had to use a spell. Engulfed in purple energy, he prepared to attack. The king released a bolt of lightning that shot into the sky, illuminating everything around him with a purple glow. After the impact, Prua fell to the ground, his body frozen by lightning bolts. Jared, sitting on the roof of the nearest house, suggested that he finally surrender. If they had fought with swords, Prua would have been a strong opponent. He was fast and strong. Given all the circumstances of their current fight, Jared had calculated everything, staying at the right distance at all times. This distance was not within Prua's attack range, but it also did not reach the operating range of his artifact. The enemy was not going to give in. Finally getting to his feet, he unleashed a level 3 attack. The veins on his face stood out, and with a challenge in his eyes, he asked everyone to guess who would emerge victorious from this fight. Jared smiled and replied, confident in his victory. Hearing this, Prua's rage grew even greater. The man wanted to shut the king up as quickly as possible. Using level 4 strength, Prua pushed off the ground. The enemy's powerful and high jump frightened Jared, who was hovering at a decent height. Prua flew towards him at great speed, blade in hand. The blade passed through the body as if it were almost immaterial. There was a cry of pain. Prua was pierced by his own blade, which pierced his chest. Jared initially feigned fear and shock, but his feigned emotions quickly gave way to a grin. He thought it all through again. Comparing Duca and Prua, one could come to the conclusion that they have many similarities and just as many differences. They were both strong, but Duca became weaker over time. Prua, on the other hand, was at the height of his powers and skills. With Duca, Jared knew the tactics: dodge familiar attacks and gradually reduce his health. But the strategy that worked against Duca was useless against Proi or Capri. But the king of Civia managed to notice something. Prua had the ability of recklessness. With this, Prua was able to reach his peak form too quickly, increasing his physical abilities. Therefore, the king decided to irritate the enemy with ridicule, so that he would quickly increase his forces to the maximum. And when Prua was furious to the limit, his mind was clouded by recklessness. Taking advantage of the moment during Prua's final attack, Jared placed a portal in front of himself. And it was precisely because of this that the blade pierced not him, but the enemy's body. Prua had screwed up. He was writhing in pain and rage, not understanding where exactly he had gone wrong. Observing this, the king turned to him and explained that the reason for his mistake was his mind clouded by malice. Jared wasn't going to mess around with him for long. The man had ruined too many with his product. In his hand was a bag of drugs that the criminal sold to people. And, pushing this bag into Prua's mouth, the king announced that this would be his parting gift. The drug dealer had long bragged about his product, telling how people would do anything to get their hands on it. And now he was experiencing the effects of the drug himself. His mouth was foaming and his head was thrown back. For his crimes, Prua will be beheaded. After completing another mission, Jared received an increase in the level of public order in Mallorca as a reward. Meanwhile, the battle between the Civia soldiers and Prua's guards was also coming to an end. When the king appeared on the battlefield, Lakis informed him that they had already dealt with them. Jared responded by saying that although Prua's squad had been defeated, there were still many criminals at large. The king intended to deal with them all before the morning, and in order to free Mallorca from the grip of crime, Jared ordered the destruction of anyone who dared to resist. After a hard night, Lakis was clearly tired. The man stopped, watching the floating king. He thought about how Jared usually acted wisely, but this time he was different. The king showed his harshness and determination. People crowded around. Looking at the sunlit king, it seemed as if they were looking at the rising emperor. Lakis's devotion has increased, and when it reaches 200 points, he will unlock the first level of awakening. After cleaning up Mallorca's criminal underworld, Jared is immersed in paperwork. The guy was exhausted by the bureaucracy, of which there was too much. Besides, he still had some important things to do. His first plan was to tour the tombs of Mallorca to build up more strength, and then he had to find a specialist who would be engaged in the extraction of the underground resource, caldium. Caldium was stronger than iron and was still unknown to the public. It would only be discovered 13 years later. That's why it was important to get to it first. This would allow us to make weapons of a completely new level. But right now, Jared had paperwork to sort out. His suffering was interrupted by the fact that he remembered how Hayes had already helped him with similar matters. A smile appeared on his face, happy that he would soon see her again. Jared began a talent hunt in hopes of finding specialists to help run Mallorca. Settling into a comfortable chair, popcorn in hand, he was ready to get acquainted with the first candidate. He turned out to be a talented politician, Tonio. He was perfectly suited to the role of reformer of Mallorca. Joyfully, Jared voted yes. But, to his regret, it turned out that Tonio was executed while he was Horgus's advisor. Second candidate, Katie. The girl was an excellent specialist in the field of business. Not as joyfully as last time, but the king was also in favor. Once again, it turned out that Katie had long been banished after she asked Horgus for a budget. The last candidate was Marklin. The man was very smart and good at manipulation. This time, Jared was especially hesitant in agreeing because it was already necessary to take at least someone. And, as is already the case, it turned out that he fled from Mallorca after the overthrow of Horus. Upon learning of this, the king froze with an empty gaze and a hopeless look. The glasses lay nearby, and along with them, the remnants of his hope of finding good specialists. He was in despair, not understanding whether there were any talented people in Mallorca at all. He even began to think about inviting Oberyn and Abila here, but this option was no good, because Civia needed them. There were enough problems already. Complaints from the head of the City Hall's labor department, non-payment of wages, and so on. A whining Jared was found by Lakis, who again brought disappointing news. As it turned out, a number of problems arose in the village of Devani, which is located in the southwest. The newly appointed village leader turned out to be a lazy person who did absolutely nothing. The people of Devon begged Lakis to do something, kneeling and crying. Moreover, the leader was also a drunkard who drew obscenities. The only thing he did was gain control over the territory. Jared, furious at the news, literally blushed. He was determined to personally punish the lazy guy. Having arrived in the village at the required address, the butler escorted Jared and his retinue to the required room. A second later, the door shattered into pieces. The king was clearly not in a good mood. Jared and company walked into the room, ready to meet with the leader, Julian. The lazy man did not respond to Lakis's cries, and the guards behind him seemed to have seen those very drawings. The king's companion looked at the wall with admiration and a blush. It contains the very same obscenity that Lakis warned the king about. Seeing their reaction, Lakis became even more angry. A voice came from a dark corner where some of the drawings and empty bottles were lying around. The voice belonged to Julian, who was sitting in the lotus position. Jared immediately used spiritual eye and was stunned by what he saw. Before that, he met many unique and talented people whom he was able to bring to their best form. But Julian was not like that. He was almost perfect, being level 65. Julian lazily closed his eyes, wondering what had brought them here. Lakis had already started an aggressive monologue, but Jared stopped him, wanting to talk to the leader himself. The king did not understand how, having such skills, Julian managed to hide them. Jared asked why he wasn't doing anything for the good of the village. Julian calmly replied that the job was too boring. Taking a sip from his mug, he also added that he would be much more suited to a more difficult job than in a quiet village. Lakis, unable to bear it, nevertheless intervened in their dialogue. He took out his blade, wanting to shut Julian up. Jared, on the other hand, seemed quite calm. He sat down on the floor and addressed the leader again. He asked again if he was saying that such work was not suitable for him, to which he heard an affirmative answer. Jared smiled, asking if it was really a matter of reluctance rather than his inability to do the job. The leader's eyes widened in surprise at this question, but his face soon became calm again, and he repeated what he had said before. It was all a matter of reluctance. Jared's smile widened. He narrowed his eyes and asked if Julian could prove it. The leader smiled slyly, inviting the king to watch him from the side. Their unnatural smiles made Lakis feel uneasy. Calling his servant to him, Julian asked him to bring him all the old documents. He was going to look through everything there was, including unimportant documentation. While they were waiting for the papers, the leader walked over to the wall with his drawings. Turning to Jared with an awkward smile, he asked him to help him photograph these masterpieces. The company that arrived began to clear the wall. Soon, Julian began receiving peasants. He responded to the first woman with advice on her concerns about raising a calf. He also resolved the issue of milling flour and wages for this work, and also helped beekeepers decide what to do with a hive in which the population had decreased. By whispering to Lakis that someone was wasting money from the budget, he infuriated him even more. Jared was amazed. Julian had done a month's worth of work in half a day. Now it's time to talk to him alone. Sitting down at the table, Jared acknowledged that the leader was talented, and he had seen it with his own eyes. Julian replied that he had also come to certain conclusions. Before that, he had not even tried, but had only put off the work. Jared smiled. He noticed that the leader had managed to lure him here, and now he was curious about what would happen next. Julian also smiled, realizing that he had been found out. The leader admitted that he had business with the king. After that, he asked about Jared's dream. He was curious about what the king aspired to the most. Julian had asked other monarchs this question before. One had replied that it was none of his business. The second is that the leader is too arrogant for a commoner. Horus said his dream was the growth of the nation. Then he added that Julian was driven by vanity. The answers were not what he expected. The leader had hoped for ambition, but felt insignificant next to the king. But Jared's answer was different. The king said he wanted to become a hero to the entire continent. He did not want to be an ordinary ruler of small territories. He wanted world fame. Julian's face showed surprise. He asked if Jared was lying. To this, the king asked a rhetorical question, making it clear that he had spoken the truth. After opening the bottle and filling a glass, Julian happily explained that he had always wanted to find someone he could look up to. The leader asked the king to lead the conglomerate of territories to ensure his dream. Jared, also taking a glass of drink, agreed. Smiling, the king also offered to watch him in action. Julian laughed and said he wouldn't betray someone he respected unless Jared seriously disappointed him. Lacus, standing below the room, eavesdropped on their conversation. The king proposed a toast to eternal cooperation. He decided that he would take Julian to help him govern Majorca. Meanwhile, in Civia, Hayes was cleaning up as usual. The girl had already managed to miss Jared. Suddenly, Orson, Isabella, and Oberyn appeared in the corridor, heatedly discussing something. They intended to pay a visit to Majorca to see the king and see how things were going. And while Isabella supported Orson's proposal for the trip, Oberyn noticed Hayes standing nearby. The man invited her to join them so that she could also greet the king. The girl's eyes lit up, and a wide smile spread across her face. Hayes happily accepted the offer. In Majorca, after some time, work was already in full swing. Julian lived up to expectations in his new position. They spent the whole week working in the office. Their everyday life could now be brightened by Hayes, who, as usual, tried to please the king. This time, she brought a flower tea that helped with weight loss, although Jared's diet had long since ended. Julian watched as the girl fluttered around the king, showering him with offers of help. Unable to bear it, he himself suggested to the king to take a break, although Jared convinced him that everything was fine. Julian did not back down. He was convinced that the king needed to rest. Soon, having bowed, Julian left to meet with his vassals. These vassals were worried visitors from Civia, who were concerned about Jared's ability to handle affairs in Majorca. But after meeting Julian, all their doubts were dispelled. They were left in extreme delight. Still sitting in the office, Jared allowed himself to be distracted a little and drink some tea brought by Hayes. He invited the girl to join, but she was embarrassed. Their statuses were too different. The king smiled and remarked that when they were alone, none of this mattered. Hayes calmed down a little after hearing this and still accepted the offer. Having poured hot tea into cups, they began to drink tea. As Hayes took a careful first sip, Jared suddenly turned to her, offering to quit her job as a maid. The tea immediately spilled, pouring onto the girl. What she heard made her feel nervous, and suddenly tears came to Hayes's eyes. She was sincerely worried that the king said this because she was a bad servant. Moreover, when she arrived in Majorca, she noticed that the castle was perfectly clean. Apparently, they managed without her, but Jared was quick to reassure her, saying that he was only practicing cleansing magic. This skill will still be useful to him, since Hayes has now become a healer and must take a higher position. But Hayes still seemed worried. She was worried that someone else would be courting the king. After listening to the girl's opinion, the king sighed with a smile on his face. And then, suddenly changing his tune, he tried to insist on his own more convincingly. While their showdown was in full swing, the pendant, lying to the side, suddenly began to glow. The boys turned around, watching as the artifact took off, illuminating everything around with a green glow. The pendant seemed to be trying to transmit some signals, after which it fell back to the place where it had been lying. This pendant previously belonged to a criminal. This artifact was considered the most common. Its power was to increase skills to 25, but Jared knew something else about it. The pendant was the key to the catacombs beneath Mallorca. Suddenly, the king turned his attention to Hayes, inviting her to take a walk. Meanwhile, in the small town of Morales, in the kingdom of Lentus, a postman was delivering a letter to Sir Belton. Having received his letter and several large packages to boot, Belton was confused. Having said goodbye to the postman, he went to his room to find out the contents of the letter and the bags. Belton seemed pleasantly surprised when he saw the sender's name. The letter stated that Jared suspected that he had reached the level of 5th-class magic, and in addition, the king asked for help. Belton found gold in the packages he had delivered. Apparently, the king hoped that Belton would honor him with a visit for this. While thinking about the offer, suddenly, Belton was enveloped in a haze and took on a different appearance. Instead of a young guy, the letter in his hands was now held by a 9th-level mage, a gray-haired old man named Belhard. What interested him was that Jared wrote about some kind of clue that made him think he had reached level 5. After all, often even the most brilliant magicians do not even know what needs to be done to improve the class of magic. The magician looked at the letter again, trying to figure out who this Jared was. It dawned on him. It seemed that the sender really was the worthless, as the magician considered, son of Barrett. Jared had once pursued him, and so the letter seemed like a lie to him, but Balhard still decided to set out on his journey. He wanted to find out everything, and, after all, he was a great magician with good instincts. At this time, Jared and Hayes were already walking along the forest path. Hayes was worried. She felt like the forest was dangerous, but Jared quickly reassured her. Although the king himself also thought that the atmosphere in this place was rather eerie, he recalled that even during the development of the game, no one knew about the location of the catacombs. The players were in despair, but they managed to find a clue in a photo of the developer on a social network. The mirror in the photo reflected part of the monitor. Then it was possible to understand that the catacombs were located near a certain tree. And now Jared has personally found this same tree. Everything seemed quite ordinary, except for the green trees. But suddenly, Hayes noticed sand that seemed to be hovering above the roots. Jared immediately ordered her to hide behind him and take 5 steps back. Within a couple of seconds, a huge face formed from a billion grains of sand was looking at them. It was Mahart, who guarded the catacombs from outsiders, and he seemed to have figured out Jared's secret about his reincarnation. He was clearly unhappy that such a damned man, not of this world, had decided to appear before him. Jared was stunned to realize that he knew everything. Mahart immediately ordered the king to leave this place. If their curses touched, the world would end. The king was still in shock that Mahart knew who he really was, but doubts still haunted him. The king could not understand whether Mahart was addressing his eye, imprisoned in Jared's body. The king's gaze became more confident when he asked for what purpose Mahart was saying all this. In response to this, he received only a refusal to continue the dialogue further. Jared didn't even think about obeying. The way Mahart spoke was completely different from his speech in the game. Magic spheres appeared around the king. Mahart's face became even more menacing. Without further delay, the king attacked the sand spirit with magical streams. Soon, all that was left of Maharta were piles of sand lying here and there. Having found the entrance to the catacombs, Jared and Hayes moved inside. Returning to his residence in Mallorca, Jared immediately got to work. Now, sitting over the drawn diagrams of the catacombs, he began to think seriously about something. Hayes decided to find out what happened to the king. She was worried that he didn't like her drawings, but Jared was pleased with the result. Hayes did a perfect job and drew everything they saw in the catacombs. The king could not even imagine that the girl was so good at drawing. As it turned out, she learned this from her father. Jared made Hayes happy by noting that it was a useful skill. At this time, everyone in the kitchen was waiting for the arrival of Chef Mary in Mallorca, and Jared asked Hayes to cook him something, causing the girl to experience another surge of joy. Hayes rushed enthusiastically to the kitchen. Jared was sometimes even frightened by the girl's assertiveness. Left alone, he returned to work. He and Hayes had explored about half of the catacombs. It was strange that only safe areas with no enemies were unlit. But the most important thing there was the ancient tomb of Maharta, known as the Mirror Dungeon. Only by killing Prua could the Mirror Dungeon quest be opened. The drug dealer Prua, at one time, became a magnate precisely thanks to the artifacts stolen from the tomb. Even before the rebirth, Jared remembered how players had to suffer to find dungeons. The dungeon's fame grew, attracting guilds to try to be the first to clear the tomb. By cooperating with other players, it was possible to disperse other guests of the dungeon during a raid. This is how many players reasoned. But in reality, they were unable to even approach the boss, which was Mahart, who easily destroyed them. This led to the formation of guild alliances to gain a chance to challenge the dungeon again. But in the end, this didn't help either. They were defeated again. The most interesting thing is that, as a result, the small guild managed to clear the dungeon. Jared tried to think through everything, because the slightest mistake could cost him his life when confronted with Mahart. A few days later, Hayes stood in the castle corridor thinking about the king. She felt like he had been acting strangely lately. He cleaned the castle, calling it training. He bought up weapons artifacts that then lay idle. He studied drawing, presenting it as part of his education. All this aroused suspicion. But Hayes reassured herself that there was definitely some logical explanation for this. When the king was once again learning to draw, Aki approached him, clearly interested in what he saw. Jared was clearly pleased with the boy and asked him to find buyers for Julian's obscene drawings. Seeing them, Aki blushed. But, quickly pulling himself together, he agreed to find those who would want to buy the drawings. The king looked away and asked Julian why he was drawing something like that, to which he replied that he simply had free time. Jared was stunned by this answer. He didn't understand how he could find free time with his schedule. A guard entered the room, announcing the arrival of a crew from Civia. It was time to move out. The king called out to Hayes and asked her to help with the armor. The girl helped Jared secure all the necessary ammunition. After that, she asked if he was heading towards the ruins where they had wandered earlier. Jared confirmed her suspicions. As expected, the girl wanted to go with him, but this time it was better for her to stay. She lowered her head and said that it would be better if the king did not go to such dangerous places. And this time Jared shared her feelings. Playing the game allowed you to recover, but now this place is a reality where there will be no second chance. But he needed to get the reward of the Mirror Dungeon. And, going down to the guests from Civia, Jared was glad that he had called the best of the best to help. Isabel, Ella, and Chloe were already waiting for him on the street. Soon the company arrived at the entrance to the catacombs. With the maps drawn by Hayes, it will be possible to follow a specific route. Chloe asked the king a question. She understood why Jared had called Isabel and Ella to the raid, but she didn't understand why he decided to call her. Jared looked at her with a smile, assuring her that she was an important member of the team. Chloe seemed to freeze. The elf definitely didn't consider herself a professional. After some time, the company was already wandering along the roads of the dungeon. Ella wondered why Jared needed to come here. Was it really because of the power of darkness that they were in the dungeon? The king explained that he was here for one artifact, and the power of darkness did not interest him. Ella felt relieved. If Jared wanted the powers of darkness, she would have fought him. Jared smiled nervously, agreeing that it was indeed a relief, since he hadn't wanted to get into a fight with Ella. His attention shifted to the warrior's glasses. The king wondered why she was so sensitive to light. Isabel noticed that the path was gradually becoming lighter, which meant that they were getting closer to the exit of the labyrinth. After the labyrinth, they will need to go through another path, consisting of chambers and ending in a tomb. The dungeon raid has officially begun. The first to stand in their way were the clay soldiers. Jared told Isabel to use the tactics she had learned earlier. The girl dropped to one knee and began to work. Black energy began to ooze from her hand. It was the black body summon spell. The clay soldiers looked in surprise at the black stream that was approaching them. Suddenly, a magical flow attacked them, causing heavy damage. The army moved towards Isabel. They ran past Jared as if they didn't notice him. Taking advantage of the situation, the king also attacked using magic. The attack literally caused some of the soldiers to crack and crumble into pieces. Chloe also participated in the fight, cutting the enemy with her blade. Several of the decapitated clay soldiers dropped valuable purple stones from their bodies. Noticing them, Isabel turned to Jared, asking why the little people were running towards her. The king didn't know for sure, but perhaps the soldiers recognized Isabel's magic. They are usually the first to attack dark mages. After defeating the clay army, it was time to dress up. Jared handed the stones to Chloe and Isabel. Having donned disguises in the form of clay heads, the company finally entered the door, which was guarded by an army. Inside, an unexpected sight awaited them. In front of them were thousands of clay soldiers. Ella was amazed to see that an army of more than 2,000 soldiers had been hiding underground all this time. Isabel was concerned about the effectiveness of this disguise, but Jared assured her that the main thing was to act like them. As she walked between the lines of soldiers, Isabel was clearly nervous. Jared knew they were surrounded by 504 soldiers. When a group of 500 people made a raid, there were about 3,000 clay guards. Jared knew they had an advantage over previous groups. Their company was small and inconspicuous. Plus, thanks to the camouflage effect Chloe had cast, they had wonderful camouflage. Finally, they passed the guard-filled hall and Jared encouraged Isabel, glad that everything worked out. Chloe also seemed pleased that her disguise skills had come in handy. And although the clay men's eyesight was not the best, nevertheless, without masks, the company would have been quickly caught. Chloe noted that dungeon raids were fun, but Jared wasn't sure what emotion she said. All this praise was observed by Isabel, who, for now, remained silent. But it didn't last long. A second later, she was next to Jared, indignant that she had actually helped him too. Realizing that there was no other way out of this situation, he simply resigned himself to it. By applauding Isabel and praising her, he seemed to have finally pleased the girl. Ella and Chloe just watched the show from the sidelines. Finally, having gone a little further, the company came across a huge clay figure, which was striking in its size. Isabel thought that all these clay men looked a bit like the undead. And this was not surprising, because both of them were the result of curses that did not belong to dark magic. Before Mahart fell into hibernation, he cursed his subjects to be forever young. And since most of them found it difficult to maintain their original appearance, they lost it and became clay soldiers. Having learned about this, Ella concluded that Mahart was not a kind monarch to his subjects. Jared also mentioned that some people manage to keep part of their real body, so you have to keep your eyes open. Suddenly, the head of the huge statue turned. Where there had been emptiness, eyes suddenly appeared, alive, watching. Suddenly, the clay figure jumped up, right above Jared and the others. And then, falling, she dealt a powerful blow. Jared managed to fly up with the help of magic, grabbing Isabel in his arms. Chloe and Ella also managed to dodge. The king did not understand why the statue suddenly attacked. This did not happen during the game. He was now increasingly tormented by suspicions that after his rebirth, This world had changed. But the statue wasn't going to wait for Jared to think. The figure stretched out its arm and jumped into the air. An attempt to catch the king and Isabel in the hand was unsuccessful. Jared managed to quickly escape. Shouting to the others to run away from the clay monster, Ella prepared to attack. Her sword erupted with an unprecedented force, like an electric charge. And, having waited for the right moment, Ella released this charge into the monster. But to everyone's surprise, such a powerful attack did not seem to harm the clay statue. Ella tensed. This monster was not supposed to be resistant to electricity, but it didn't even flinch. The angry figure tried to strike again. Ella's green eyes sparkled in anticipation of a fight. Their glow was visible even from under the clay mask. Jared suddenly shouted out a greeting to Mahart, his hand thrust forward. The attacking figure suddenly froze without delivering a blow. The monster leaned over to Jared and looked him over carefully. And then, as if nothing had happened, it simply turned around and left. Ella asked in surprise what had just happened. She did not understand why the statue had retreated because of some phrase. Jared explained that it was some kind of password. But what worried him was that this clay doll was different from the ones they had met before. It was invincible. Although the probability that the statue would become invincible was small, it still existed. Chloe didn't believe in invincibility, but what the curse created could have unpredictable properties. There could be many side effects in general. Some curse spawns could not leave a certain area. Some had no intelligence, and some did not distinguish between enemies and allies, attacking everyone in a row. And it was precisely for such situations that the creator could create a password. Jared was in no hurry to explain to the guys how he knew the password, and the others seemed to just accept it. Moving into the next room, a new test awaited the company. Their next enemy was already waiting for them there. The two-headed monster, the sun and the moon, declared the trespassers had entered the sanctuary of Maharta. This monster played the role of a priest, whose powers grew in proportion to the number of violators. After asking Ella and Chloe to distract the enemy, Jared considered his plan of action. But the monster was not going to wait any longer, and unleashed his army on the company. The strange creatures again ignored everyone except Isabel. The girl was clearly not happy to be the center of such attention. Jared ran after Isabel, who was running away from the monsters, to help. Meanwhile, Ella and Chloe came face to face with their main enemy. Chloe rushed to attack. Another strange figure resembling a bird appeared behind the priest. The bird immediately struck with its beak, trying to destroy Chloe, but the elf's reaction was faster. Pushing off the bird's body, she pounced on the priest with a sword, leaving bloody cuts on him. The enraged enemy transformed a body part into a huge hand, attacking Chloe. The two-headed man finally lost his temper, taking out his anger on his guards, calling them brainless slaves. Ella, still watching from the side. Turning to the monster, she asked whether this was the right way to treat one's subjects. Hearing her question, the priest seethed with irritation. To him, they were slaves who followed orders. While dodging his attacks, Ella added that Mahart was probably also using him as a tool to achieve his goals. The monster suddenly froze, pondering her words. One of the heads, Lena, stated that they were the most loyal subjects. But Ella continued to raise doubts in the priest, pointing out that he was just Mahart's puppy. The sun seemed to believe her, but the moon remained adamant. He rushed at Ella, intending to deal with her for what he had said earlier. But suddenly, during his flight towards Ella, Chloe attacked his body with a sword. Striking blow after blow, she left bloody wounds. Having pierced his back with a sword, the monster fell to the floor. Ella pressed the sword deeper, again taunting Lena about his terrible self-control. After another blow, Lena was finished. Ella knew she had only managed it so easily, thanks to Jared's advice to weaken them with self-doubt. Calling out to the boys, she noticed that they had also almost finished with the sun. Isabel, standing at his head, seemed to have already subdued him with her charms. Over the next 3 hours, the guys managed to pass through 29 chambers, having enlisted the support of the sun. There were only two left. Ella looked forward to the next tests with interest. Besides, she couldn't help but think that Jared had some unique knowledge about this place. He had calculated everything, including Chloe's inexperience. By placing the responsibility on her, he left Ella without a job. But this only made her happy. Although Ella was outraged that Jared hired her as a guard, instead of this job, she was assigned to carry a bag of stones. Approaching the next cell, Jared explained that there would only be one armed opponent waiting for them there. There wasn't much of a plan other than a frontal attack, but he certainly wouldn't fall for cheap tricks. This monster was so strong that it easily dealt with even a raid of allied guilds. Having opened the gates, the guys went inside. At the end of the room sat Maharta's soldier, the Golden Hulk, capable of killing with one blow. Hulk warned the company to leave, and not to try to interrupt the sleep of his master Mahart. Isabel, horrified, concluded that the monster possessed very intense energy. The feeling of his presence filled and consumed everyone around. Without waiting for a reaction from the others, Hulk turned his attention to the priest. In his eyes, the sun was now a traitor. The priest tried to justify himself in a panic. He nervously explained that he had reasons for bringing them here, but the Hulk didn't want to listen to him. With one swift movement, he decapitated the sun. The bloody body collapsed to the floor. Chloe, standing nearby, was horrified. For Hulk, there was no explanation for betrayal. He served his master faithfully no matter what. While the monster was distracted by speeches about his loyalty, Jared took advantage of the moment. Releasing a fireball, he attacked the Hulk. Having reached its target, the flame flared up even more strongly, consuming the monster. When the smoke cleared, an unharmed Hulk emerged from it, filled with the desire to execute them without mercy. Using a combination of the magic missile and nightmare spells, Jared formed multiple magical spheres. It's time for another attack. The spheres crashed into the Hulk, one after another, but did not seem to cause the slightest damage. But this did not stop Jared. He continued to launch sparkling magical attacks at the monster. Taking the weapon in his hands, Hulk prepared to attack. He swung and delivered a powerful blow, destroying the place where the king had stood just a moment ago. Moving with lightning speed, Jared dodged the Hulk's axe. Using Flicker, gave him a few seconds to analyze the situation. Jared knew that the monster's ability to kill in one hit made him a level stronger than the rest. It was literally a killing force. If the Hulk manages to touch the king even a little, there won't be a wet spot left. Before him was an opponent who possessed greater speed than Prua and greater strength than Capri. If Jared had been alone, this fight would have been a lost cause, but he had his friends with him. Chloe, suddenly appearing near the Hulk's face, struck with her sword. The weapon broke without causing even a scratch on the monster. Hulk prepared to counterattack. But this time, it was Isabel who entered the fight with him. Thanks to her witchcraft, she greatly weakened the monster's vision. Jared's frontal attack caused the Hulk to lose his guard, opening the way for the others to attack. At the very beginning, when the king fired a fireball at him, he blocked Hulk's line of sight. Once in its blind spot, Chloe and Isabel surrounded the monster. Now the whole team was continuously attacking the Hulk. While Isabel was releasing dangerous magical currents, Chloe was striking with her sword. Hulk tried to dodge each of the attacks, but it was simply impossible. The guys did not give him a second of peace. Swinging his weapon, the monster tried to get rid of at least one of them, but each one managed to deftly dodge. After releasing another fireball, Jared was finally able to damage the Hulk. The monster understood that he couldn't last long like this. The most effective tactic for him was to kill at least one of them, to interrupt the flow of attacks. After waiting for the right moment, he rushed at Jared, wanting to finish off the leader of the group. Using the acceleration, the king tried to escape from his sight, but the Hulk quickly noticed him. Reacting instantly, the monster struck the king, cutting off part of his face. To his surprise, Hulk heard Jared's voice behind him. The king carried it out by using illusion magic. with the help of which he was able to create clones of himself. 10 minutes of fighting seemed like an eternity. To make matters worse, Ella had retreated. With her help, they would have certainly won, but the warrior refused such a dangerous fight. In fact, there were probably several reasons why she stayed away. But the most important thing was the instincts that told her that this fight would be fatal for her. Besides, she saw that these three were developing at an incredibly fast pace. And it looks like this is what finally allowed them to defeat the Hulk. Finally, the monster, out of respect for those who were able to overcome him, gave them advice. He advised the boys to leave and not engage in a fight with the Emperor, whom they would definitely not defeat in such a state. His body crumbled. The last thing he said was a warning that if they continued, they would meet him again. Isabel discovered a piece of cloth that came out of the Hulk's body. It was Rold's mirror armor. Ella and Isabel were skeptical about the find, suspecting that it might be cursed. But Jared didn't let them get rid of her, despite the girl's ardent desire to do so. The king realized the value of the armor forged by Rold. Whoever wore it would be under the blacksmith's protection. Rold's soul will create a force field around the wearer of the armor that will not let arrows through. In addition, the armor was surprisingly thin and light, so it could be worn over other armor. The girls clearly had no claim to this miracle, so they generously allowed Jared to appropriate it. The king couldn't get enough of the find, hugging and pressing the armor to himself. But soon the memories interrupted the joy. He remembered that when this was all just a game, the user who had the armor said that he made it himself. Then he gave him a ton of metal and materials to create, and now he wasn't sure if it was true. At this point, Jared could remember little from his past life, because it had been a long time ago. Soon the company reached another huge gate, on which a stone lion's head was adorned. Despite Isabel's enthusiasm and readiness to fight, Jared said that he would go on his own. He explained that if the curses created by Mahart reached the girl, they would destroy her consciousness. It was too dangerous. On Jared's hand sparkled the ring of Gracia, which protected the soul of the king. Before entering the gate, Jared asked the guys for a favor. He asked Isabel to absorb through the hole all the demonic energy that Mahart would emit. The demonic energy was like a toxin, and although it might be unpleasant for Isabel, she was capable of it. The girl agreed to help. The king asked Chloe to guard the entrance from clay soldiers who could interfere with their fight with Mahart. Ella also asked how she could help, to which Jared, smiling, gave her a very important task. The warrior had to guard a bag of stones. This task, apparently, did not delight her. Having opened the entrance to the tomb with the key pendant, Jared finally entered inside. Getting here required a lot of effort, as the king said out loud as he approached the stone coffin. Jared took out a staff that allowed him to enhance the power of its owner with the help of drawn circles. The stone coffin glowed green and then swung open. Mahart himself, an emperor with level 101, emerged from it. Noticing that Jared had handled all the obstacles on his way well, Mahart suddenly fell silent mid-sentence. Jared, interrupted while drawing circles with his wand, stood in an awkward pause. The emperor examined his tomb. Drawings were visible everywhere, and this quickly made him lose his temper. Outraged that Jared dared to draw on his grave. Having gathered himself together, the king addressed him, declaring that he intended to finally end his life. In response to Jared's accusations of cruelty, Mahart claimed that he had created this land for the subjects he loved. But the king knew that all this was only for the sake of the revival and conquest of the continent. And what kind of love can we talk about when Mahart turned his subjects into slaves, bringing them to death and leaving them to rot? But the emperor did not admit this. He stood his ground, saying that they had given their lives and blessings for him. Jared replied that he was only so afraid of death that he faked immortality. These words finally drove the emperor mad. He raised his hand and attacked Jared with a curse. The king felt as if he was breaking into pieces, but Gracia's holy ring helped him repel the attack. Still, it wasn't without consequences. His head was splitting and cracking. Meanwhile, Mahart attacked him again, using the painful curse of the sinner. The curse rushed towards the king, opening its terrible mouth and empty eye sockets. Jared knew it was a stigma that ate people alive. There was no point in dodging, it would follow him anyway. The king remained where he was, facing the curse. He took advantage of his only chance to save himself, to dodge her at the moment when she reached him with the help of a blink. This allowed the king to seal her within the circle he had previously drawn with his staff. Mahart seemed delighted. The boy had managed to escape the painful brand, and even seal it. By creating a magical fence, Mahart made it impossible for Jared to leave the tomb while the emperor was alive. He offered the boy a deal, to become his loyal subject in exchange for immortality and power. Jared responded ironically that in this case, immortality is equivalent to becoming a bald skeleton that cannot rot. Mahart was furious at his answer, taking it as an insult. Rage helped him to burst out with even greater force. The emperor unleashed one attack after another. Jared dodged and fired a fireball that hit its target. Mahart's body was torn to pieces, but the emperor quickly regenerated and regained his former form. Jared was happy that he had to use regeneration, just like in the game. It gave him hope. Wanting to test who would exhaust himself faster, the king launched another attack. Spears appeared around Mahart, hovering above him, ready to strike. Using artifacts in combination with magic, Jared managed to damage the emperor's body again. His head was pierced by a purple magical stream, causing him to regenerate again. It didn't take long, and soon huge stems appeared around Mahart and rushed towards the guy. Using the shield, Jared broke through them, not allowing the stems to touch him. The battle seemed to go on forever. Jared's strength was reaching its limit. Forced to continually fight against magic that was stronger than him, the king was exhausted. During this fight, he had already been on the brink of death more than once, and his mana and physical strength were almost exhausted. But the king still managed to hold on, because he knew that there was still a little time left. Mahart was also amazed at the boy's endurance and how desperately he fought. The emperor knew that Jared's tactics were working and might work in the end. It seemed to Mahart that the king's struggle only appeared desperate. He suspected that he was not as simple as he wanted to seem. The emperor became interested in what the guy was hiding. Suddenly, Mahart felt something was wrong. Something was happening to him. His life force seemed to be slowly leaving him. The emperor fell to one knee, trying to maintain his balance. Trying to understand the reason, Mahart noticed that all this time he was in the circle drawn by Jared. It dawned on him that this was not just a drawing. It was a magic circle. Now the emperor realized that this was what the boy had been trying to hide. Bursting with magical energy, Mahart tested his guesses. He turned angrily to the boy, claiming that he had sealed magic in the circle that would allow him to return an attack to the enemy. Jared was horrified. His opponent had figured him out. Forming a chain of mana around himself, the emperor prepared to finally continue the battle. His anger only increased when he realized what methods the guy was using. He quickly flew towards Jared, closing the distance between them in a matter of moments. The boy tried to fly higher, but the emperor grabbed his leg with chains. And then, pulling the chain holding the king, he hit the ground with it with all his might. After a painful fall, Jared tried to get up, but the emperor did not give him a second to catch his breath. The next attack was already flying towards the king. Jared used the shield to block her, but the lack of strength from fatigue was already making itself felt. The shield shattered into pieces, opening the way to the guy. Jared fell again, his hand badly burned, and the remnants of the magical attack smoldering on his clothes and body. Mahart approached the guy and delivered a strong knee blow to the solar plexus. Now the king was in even more unbearable pain, as the emperor talked about how he had originally just been playing with him. Mahart also stated that after such meanness from Jared, he would not hold back and struck him in the face again. The guy had less than 10% health left, He urgently needed treatment and rest, but there was no time for it. The Emperor's hand tightened on the neck of the boy, who, despite everything, did not give up trying to attack. But Jared's attempts were in vain. With one movement of his hand, Mahart interrupted the process of forming a magical charge. He stated that this was the end, and Jared should not even try to use magic anymore. But the king had no intention of accepting his fate. His fist clenched with all his might. He swung and hit the Emperor in the face. But the blow was so weak that Mahart did not even feel it. Wanting to finally end this fight, the Emperor strengthened his hand with magic to kill the king. Before he could strike, Mark's face was suddenly pierced by a dagger that flew out of the artifact ring on Jared's hand. The guy had a few tricks up his sleeve for just such an occasion. The blades pierced the Emperor's soft body, which was as dense as sand. All of these swords were charged with divine energy, which was now rapidly spreading throughout Mahart's body. The Emperor, who possessed demonic energy, was subjected to purification magic. Divine power penetrated every cell of his body, cleansing him of dark energy. Mahart tried to resist, but it was all in vain. At the Emperor's call, hundreds of clay warriors rushed to protect him. But Chloe, following Jared's orders, entered into battle with them. She couldn't allow them to interfere in the fight between the king and Mahart. The elf dealt with them with lightning-fast movements. When she finished, she thought that it would be difficult to get through here if they were given orders to guard. When Mahart realized that all his soldiers were destroyed, he realized that Jared did not come alone. Not wanting to give up, the Emperor began to form a new magical sphere. The sphere grew at an incredible speed as Mahart screamed at Jared. The Emperor wanted to conquer the continent, and some boy decided to stop him. These thoughts made him boil with anger, and dark energy consumed all the space around him. Jared grabbed the blade that pierced Mahart's head with both hands, pushing it deeper. The last thing the king managed to respond to his opponent's words was the statement that he would unite the continent. And then, in a split second, the demonic energy exploded, bursting into a bright green glow. Isabella, seeing what happened through a hole in the wall, screamed the king's name, worried about his life. The tomb was almost completely destroyed. Only a small elevation remained, on which Jared and Mahart were. The king, mutilated and exhausted, lay unconscious on the floor. Mahart looked at him triumphantly, satisfied with his victory. But suddenly, his eyes and the magic that filled his body went out. The Emperor's body began to crumble like sand. Isabella rushed towards the guy, looking at him with alarm. Until recently, he was the weakest king. But he managed to defeat the great emperor who ruled the continent. Coming to his senses, a smile immediately appeared on Jared's face. He had won and could now enjoy the moment of triumph. Isabella desperately begged him not to die, to which Ella, standing nearby, noted that the king, in fact, does not die. Hearing Jared calling her name, Isabella immediately leaned over the king, waiting to hear what he wanted to tell her. The guy groaned, trying to ask her for something, while the girl listened in panic to his every breath. Finally, he whispered his request into her ear, asking her to take care of the artifact for him. Her sympathy turned to indignation. Having concluded that the king was a mercenary fool, she nevertheless went for the artifact. A little later, the guys, having taken all the trophies obtained during the raid, brought them to Majorca. 23 days after Jared's victory at Mahartom, life returned to normal. It was July 1st, 1414. Sitting in his residence in Majorca, it suddenly dawned on the king that he had forgotten to ask Mahart about his existence. Slapping his hand across his face, he drew the attention of Julian, who was also in the office. The boy told the king that crime rates had dropped by 90% after the installation of mana stones in Majorca and Civia. They were used as lamps, illuminating every nook and cranny. Soon they were planned to be installed everywhere except the forest. The population was happy. The streets were now much safer, especially at night. The king was able to achieve this thanks to the spoils obtained during the raid. But the huge burn on his arm was also a reminder of the fight with Mahart. Julian noticed that it still hadn't healed. The king explained that it was not a simple burn, so he did not expect the wound to heal completely. They were distracted from this topic by Aki's unusual outfit, which was just waiting for attention to be paid to it. The boy was beaming in his new clothes, which he had heard were currently in fashion among the Cinder's nobles. Aki wanted to hear what the king thought of his new look, to which Jared awkwardly replied that everyone had different tastes. And then he added that this was definitely not his style. Julian said the same thing, finally finishing off Aki. Without letting the boy suffer enough, Jared asked how things were going with Julian's drawings, which he had asked to sell. When Aki said that he had sold everything, the king was very surprised. He wondered who could have bought so much obscenity. The buyer turned out to be Mr. Ibaniba. It wasn't hard to persuade him after he looked at the drawings. Jared certainly didn't expect the noble and graceful goblin lord to buy these masterpieces. Aki added that yesterday a request was received from the Cinder's kingdom. Their army wanted to buy mines from Civia, so they offered a long-term contract. Jared crossed his arms and asked Aki to decline the offer. The boy also reported that interest in the king of Civia had increased among the nobles of the Cinder's kingdom. This was not surprising, since Civia now had the most sought-after goods. Jared believed that their interest was also due to their close proximity to his kingdom. All this gave him the idea that they were preparing for something in the kingdom of Cinders. Their king, Dr. the Ninth, will soon die. And after the death of the king, a fierce struggle for the throne will begin between his 4 sons. According to the law, Prince Petalin must become the new king. But Petalin is a follower of the black magic religion, Umbraism. Therefore, his candidacy was very controversial. Umbraism becoming the main religion of the kingdom could have bad consequences. Because of the followers of this faith, the Holy War once began, during which Umbraism engulfed all states. Jared could only watch from the sidelines, because he could not interfere in the internal politics of another kingdom. Suddenly, an alarmed haze ran into the room, reporting that trouble had occurred. It turned out that the King of Cinders wrote Jared a personal letter. But the problem was that the 4th prince, who had already crossed the border of Civia, decided to deliver it. Jared tensed when he heard this. He agreed with Jualin, who said that the news would most likely be bad. Jared suspected that he was being drawn into a not very peaceful game. Meanwhile, Prince Isiel arrived in Civia. Soon the red-haired prince was already introducing himself to the king of Civia. Jared bowed and introduced himself. Having handed over the letter, the prince said that it was an invitation to a celebration in honor of the king. He also added that the king would be pleased if Jared accepted the invitation. Opening the letter, Jared read the contents. Much of the letter was empty formality, but even though it was a personal invitation, Jared couldn't accept it. Isiel clarified that he himself asked his father to convey his message personally to Jared. The prince showered him with praise. Jared smiled awkwardly and replied that he was flattered by his words. Isiel continued the pleasantries, expressing a desire to have a drink together and talk. But this conversation was not destined to remain pleasant for long. After thanking for the invitation, Jared stated that he was not a subject of the Cinder's kingdom. He also added that this conversation is not very comfortable for him. The prince's face quickly darkened. Turning around, he walked towards the exit, indignantly saying that he had come for nothing. Finally, the prince added that no matter what happened to Jared, he should not worry either him or his father. Putting on a fake smile, Jared declared that he would not ignore the letter, and then said goodbye to Isiel. After the prince finally left the room, Jared breathed a sigh of relief. Isiel turned out to be much smarter than he thought. The boy had a royal aura and possessed knowledge that could serve as the foundation of a sacred state. But he wasn't careful enough. He couldn't let anyone think he had a good relationship with Jared. Leaning his head on his hand, the king decided that he would surprise him further by showing the power of the northern lands. Meanwhile, In the Kingdom of Cinders, Prince Ptalen had a meeting with a man. Ptalen arranged this meeting because the man had worked for Lord Civia for a long time. As it turned out, he worked there only during the reign of Barrett, and after his death, he left the kingdom. The prince was glad to learn about this because now he demanded that the man tell him everything he knew about Civia. Ptalen wanted to know everything about the kingdom, about the members of the ruling family. In a word, about everything. Life went on as usual in Mallorca. Mia rushed down the corridor of the residence. The girl decided to ignore Lena, who was shouting that running through the corridors using magic was prohibited. Mia ran into Jared's office, greeting him happily. But it turned out that there was no one in the office except Julian. Mia was confused, but still tried to find out from Julian about the king's location. Smiling, the man informed them that Jared had gone to Cinders 2 days ago. The trip was supposed to be short, only about 4 days. Meanwhile, Jared, taking Hayes and Aki with him, was still on the way. Hayes was very pleased with their company. It reminded her of how they had once traveled in such a train. Jared agreed, remembering how Aki had fallen into the criminal's trap. Feeling very awkward, the boy, waving his arms, asked everyone to finally forget about this incident. The king smiled and, reassuring him, noted that he was happy to meet him and enlist his support. Aki was embarrassed, and his cheeks turned pink. He thanked the king again for saving him that day. Looking out the window, Hayes noticed that they were almost there. The celebration was in full swing at King Cinders's castle. Guests in luxurious attire chatted with each other while drinking wine. The waiters were serving drinks, and the newcomers bowed to the king, expressing their respect to him. Hearing of Jared's arrival, the butler announced it to the attention of those present. The guests turned towards the entrance, expecting the appearance of that very Jared they had heard so much about. Entering the ballroom, the guy looked luxurious. His hair was beautifully styled, and his clothes fit him perfectly. Those present were amazed. Many whispered as they looked at Jared with admiration. One of the men noted that his army had recently consisted of 200 people, but now it had reached a figure of more than 5,000. Another man was shocked by this, wondering about the cost of maintaining such an army. To which one of the guests noted that Civia makes money from treatment, mines, pesticides, and much more. Approaching King Dactard, Jared bowed. But the king did not want to bore him with formalities after the journey, and told Jared to simply enjoy the evening. The guy was only glad about this, because he had nothing to talk about with the king anyway. But as soon as he moved away from Dactard, several guests of the holiday immediately approached him. Those wishing to meet Jared increasingly crowded around the guy. He was not happy with this attention, because it interfered with his main purpose for which he came here. Jared was only interested in Dactard's sons here, and one of them, the first Prince Ian, was sitting very close. Now he was ill again, suffering from some old affliction. All these illnesses could prevent him from ascending the throne. Ian was never left alone for a minute. He was surrounded by doctors and family members all the time. Jared also noticed the third prince, Jess, around whom nobles who had been displaced from the leading factions were hanging out. Although he was less popular than Ptalen, the support of the aristocrats could not be ignored. In fact, Jess was Ptalen's main rival for the throne. This led to their constant rivalry. As for Izil, he was too weak and had no loyal soldiers on his side. All these thoughts spinning in Jared's head were suddenly interrupted by someone's voice. Turning around, he recognized his interlocutor. It was the second Prince Ptalen. The Umbriest asked how best to address Jared, but the boy seemed not to hear the question. His attention was now focused on Capri, who was standing behind Ptalen. Apparently, Capri was on the side of the second prince and was ready to help him ascend the throne. Smiling, Jared finally answered the prince's question, saying that he could address him as he pleased. Ptalen replied that he had heard about Iziel's personal invitation and specified that he himself was eager to meet Jared. Iziel, watching their dialogue from the balcony, was irritated by his brother's attempts to recruit the king of Civia. Next to him stood Princess Mira, She was the king's youngest child and was clearly worried about her brother. Meanwhile, the dialogue continued downstairs. Taking a glass in his hands, Jared said that he was flattered by such attention from the prince. Ptolin responded that Jared should not be modest, because he is now one of the most successful rulers. The prince got down to business. He was surprised that someone who supposedly did not conduct foreign policy had annexed Majorca. Smiling awkwardly, Jared tried to wriggle out of it by saying it was just luck. Ptolin leaned over and looked the boy in the face. He said that they could find a common language. Besides, he thought Jared was quite ambitious. Still trying to wriggle out of it, the king explained that it was just a desperate fight for survival. And this time, Ptolin decided not to argue. Placing his hand on Jared's shoulder, he expressed a desire to meet in person sometime. Finally free of Ptolin's company, Jared's face radiated an unprecedented seriousness. But he was not destined to be alone for a while. Almost immediately, Prince Jess flew up to him. Smiling broadly, he noted that everyone today wanted to get along with a powerful man like Jared. Unlike Ptolin, Jess was clearly more cheerful and immediately noted that Jared was clearly not impressed by his brother. Now it was his turn to make contact. The prince immediately started with his trump cards, declaring that he could help with the supply of weapons. But Jared immediately rejected this offer, not wanting to be under anyone's pressure. Jess burst out laughing again. He wanted to demonstrate his interest to Jared, which he now said directly. The king of Civia responded in the same way as he had to Ptolin, noting that it was not worth such attention. This answer caused Jess and his retinue to abruptly change the mood of the conversation. His face twisted with anger. The prince was outraged that Jared communicated with Ptolin, but ignored him. Throwing up his hands and forcing a smile, Jared calmly remarked that it was more profitable for him to cooperate with Ptolin. The prince was overcome with rage. He grabbed Jared by the jacket and began shouting at him and calling him names. Isiel and his sister, who had been watching him until now, were dumbfounded by what they saw. That same evening, Mira, Isiel, and Jared met on the street. Sitting down at a secluded table, the prince immediately apologized for the behavior of his brother, who had a hot temper. Jared assured him that everything was fine, after which there was an awkward pause. Mira, sitting next to her brother, was gathering her thoughts to address the guest. However, having made up her mind, she said that she had heard a lot about Jared and his successes. Putting the cup on the saucer, the guy sternly noted that today everyone was telling him the same thing. Unable to bear it any longer, the girl nervously declared that Isiel needed his help. The prince stopped her, asking her to calm down. Mira sighed and apologized. She was very concerned that her subjects had turned their backs on her brother. Jared, still not wanting to talk about such topics in the presence of strangers, thought about how to resolve this issue. A magical glow suddenly appeared under his hand, and by using sound-blocking magic, he could finally speak to the prince and princess more directly. His first question was about Prince Pralin and Prince Jess. Jared was interested in everything Isiel knew about them. Isiel replied that although he did not follow their every step, he knew everything that was necessary about the brothers. Jared then decided to ask directly if Isiel knew that his brothers were Umbraists. The prince was indignant when he heard this question. He considered it nothing more than dirty rumors. Mira also did not remain silent. She stated that in their kingdom, they honor the divine nature of Radius. Ignoring the outrage, Jared noted that it was strange that they didn't know about it. He suggested that they either weren't as interested in national security or that their faith in the Radius Church was insufficient. But the prince protested. He and Mara didn't know about it, nor did anyone else. Jared came up with a solution. Isiel and Mara would gather all the information about the brothers. An object flew out of the king's ring that would help them with this, recording all conversations. Isiel was surprised, not understanding if this meant that Jared had decided to help him. But he objected, saying that he only wanted to help the people living in their kingdom. Jared also added that Isiel should not be afraid of the influence that others will begin to exert on him. After all, relationships between people often collapse. Realizing that blocking the sound for too long might raise suspicion, Jared suggested meeting again. Left alone, Jared was in no hurry to get up from the table. A small noise caught his attention. Suddenly, a group of warriors appeared behind him. Jared gave them orders. They were to monitor everything that happened here and report back to him. He chose each of the warriors himself, so he was confident in their professionalism. Hearing the order, the warriors disappeared in a second. It was as if they had evaporated. Jared finished his tea with a serious expression and made another important conclusion. He shouldn't have put sugar in there. In the morning, the king stood with Hayes and waited for Aki, who was late again. The girl noted that something similar had already been in Renel. She also added that the guy is the only one of the kings who is waiting for guests outside. But Jared suddenly made an offer that Hayes certainly didn't expect. He offered to buy her clothes. A blush appeared on the girl's cheeks. But despite her attempts to politely refuse, the king had already made up his mind. Taking her hand, he dragged the girl towards the store. Soon Hayes was trying on outfits, twirling around in a red dress, asking Jared what he thought of it. The king said that this outfit suits her, but the girl got a taste for it and decided that she could find an even better dress. This excitement pleased Jared, who was now sure that his idea had been a success. Suddenly, an urgent red notification appeared, informing of an emergency. It said that every year on July 1st, evil spirits invade Civia. There were only 3 weeks left until this date, and this worried the king. A massive invasion of evil spirits, or monster outbreak, is a terrible phenomenon. Until this point, monster attacks were prevented by tribes of Barrett's warriors from the north. And, from the south, they were dealt with by the warriors and allies of Ibanaba. Jared also longed to become an active participant in the fight against monsters, which would bring him a lot of experience. His attention suddenly turned to Hayes, who was already twirling around in a different dress. The king was delighted. He noticed that the girl looked like an angel in this outfit. Hayes thought about it. Within a few seconds, a great idea popped into her head on how to improve this mini-show. Healing magic sparkled in her hands. She threw her hands up and scattered it. The magical energy, taking the form of feathers, beautifully scattered throughout the room. Jared looked at the girl with admiration, unable to take his eyes off her. Now she definitely looks like an angel, standing surrounded by falling feathers. The king looked at her with a smile, and even a slight blush appeared on his cheeks. To the side, a store clerk watched this whole scene. He shed a tear, a little envious of Jared, who was actually now in the company of such an angel. Returning to Civia, Jared did not abandon the intensive training of both Isabel and himself. By refining her lust magic, Isabel made it an effective training tool. Jared's task was to resist this magic, which was quite difficult due to the girl's strength, but her skills have clearly improved. Suddenly, Hayes entered the room and saw her image in the magical flow. The surprised girl tried to understand what she had just seen, while Jared waited in horror for her reaction. He didn't understand how Hayes had ended up here at just such a moment. It had to be some kind of terrible accident. Jared quickly realized that this setup was organized by Isabel, who was now glad that Hayes would be disappointed in the king. Isabel whispered in the girl's ear that it would be better to immediately refuse such a lustful king. But Hayes suddenly stated that, of course, she could wear clothes like the one in her picture, but it would be too much. Isabel, expecting a different reaction, lost her temper and tried to cover Hayes's mouth. But Jared, pretending that everything was fine and going according to plan, simply began giving Isabel advice on how to improve her magic. Getting even more angry, she kicked Jared in the face, throwing him away. When it got dark, hunters began to gather in the Forest of Nightmares. While discussing Ronella's failure, one of them suddenly noticed a fair-haired guy who walked past. The man was outraged by the arrival of a stranger, but they quickly explained to him that he was in the presence of the ruler of Civia. As it turned out, Jared often came to this forest and even entered forbidden areas. The king, going deeper and deeper along the path, thought about why Civia developed differently from Renella, and the main reason was the invasion of monsters. In his time, Viscount Barrett became the salvation of these lands, making a huge contribution to their development. However, all the results of his efforts were regularly destroyed by invasions of evil spirits that destroyed everything in their path. And while Civia suffered from demons, Renella and Majorca lived and prospered in peace and quiet. Barrett has lived his entire life with the dream of assembling a powerful army that could resist the evil spirits. And although it was not possible to assemble a powerful army, nevertheless, Civia found safety. Jared laid out the magic stones and activated them with a spell. Columns of light immediately appeared from them. Connected to each other, these pillars created a magical dome. Meanwhile, the evil spirits have already risen. Hundreds of monsters to the beat of drums were already preparing to attack Civia. They were going to kill and eat everyone they met on their way. Today, the evil spirits considered themselves the center of the universe. Finally, the main moment they had all been waiting for arrived. The portal opened. The commander of the Blue Ogre Legions, Crandall, gave the order to advance, and the monsters, hearing the order, immediately rushed to the portal. In just a few moments, they found themselves on the lands of Civia. One of the ogres immediately noticed Jared, who was standing nearby. Considering the guy an easy target, the ogre went on the attack and swung his weapon at Jared. The leader of the monsters finally appeared from the portal, riding on an elephant. Turning to the commander, he noted that the soldiers should have already put everything in order here. The commander was confused, not understanding where they ended up. The leader was also surprised. They were supposed to be in the human world. But in fact, the monsters saw only a wasteland, instead of villages inhabited by many people. Jared addressed the undead. He explained to them that he had created a distorted dimension using a mana crystal. As a result, the monsters will not be able to go beyond the dome. And if they try, they will be teleported to the beginning of the dimension. The leader was angry. He turned to Jared to clarify whether this was his doing. The king confirmed this and added that they could consider him a representative of the people who had come out to greet them. The leader asked who he was that he could use such magic, because he had never heard of people being capable of such a thing. Jared replied that there are no such people. It's just a way to resist them. A smile appeared on the leader's face. He knew that magic of this level required a lot of strength. If you wait, the portal will disappear on its own when Jared's powers are exhausted. The leader decided to test what the boy was capable of by sending Tabanon, one of his henchmen, to him. The ogre was huge and had 2 axes on his back. Tabanon was clearly confident in his abilities. A magical bracelet flared on Jared's arm, enveloping the boy in a purple glow. The leader was horrified when he felt the boy's aura grow stronger. It was now clear that he had been hiding his strength. He also didn't understand where the ogres, who were supposed to arrive here a little earlier, had gone. The leader looked back and found the answer to his question. His warriors were defeated. Trying to stop Tabanon, to save at least someone, the leader shouted his name. But it was already too late. A fiery magical attack rained down on the ogre, burning him alive. The leader, seeing this picture, panicked even more. All that remained of the huge ogre warrior was his horn. Enraged, the leader ordered his minions to seize the magician and destroy him immediately. Jared prepared to attack again. Fireballs began to fly out from the huge magic circle, one after another. Bouncing off from the top of the dome, they fell. Hard rain. Down. Horror and fear appeared on the leader's face again. Several fireballs flew straight at him. The king of Renella, sitting in his residence, was discussing the district of Capri, which was supposed to protect him. The treaty had expired, and the king was afraid that Jared would come at any moment. He knew that something urgently needed to be done. His thoughts were interrupted by a servant who nervously reported the invasion of enemy troops. The king panicked, thinking that Jared had come for revenge, but the servant reassured him that it was unlikely to be him. There were only about 100 enemies. Hearing this, King Renel went into a rage. The servant had only scared him for nothing. Besides, they were in one of the best fortresses, so Renel didn't understand how some rabble got in here. The servant reported that most likely there were traitors in the kingdom who had let the enemies in. Renel went outside to see with his own eyes those who dared to attack the kingdom. It really irritated him that the enemy underestimated them so much. The enemy army was led by one of his former servants. Veins of rage appeared on Renel's face. He did not expect such a vile act and betrayal. The leader stated that he was guided by the idea of peace in Renel, since the king's greed had put everyone in danger. The king would not listen. Wanting to punish the offenders, he ordered the guards to seize them. One warrior behind the leader asked him to go to a safe place, assuring him that the warriors could handle it themselves. Renel became even more furious when he realized that the invaders had caught up with the traitors. The warrior in the helmet was determined. He told the king directly that he was going to take Renella away. Jared's fight to drive out the evil spirits continued. Flames raged across the battlefield, and one by one, the monsters found themselves trapped in the flames. Jared didn't even think about giving them time to catch their breath, continuously releasing magical projectiles. Suddenly, one of the goblins fired an arrow. The arrow hit the king of Civia right in the face, causing him to lose his balance. Having managed to activate the mirror armor artifact, Jared avoided injury. The goblin who had fired the arrow looked nervously at the king, who quickly noticed him. Jumping quickly from rock to rock, the monster tried to escape Jared's wrath. But he was quickly caught up with another fireball, which the king launched straight at him. As Jared continued to use magic to attack, he noticed a new notification. It announced that the king would receive the title Embodiment of Hellfire, and that the destruction from the flames would now increase by 100%. A satisfied smile appeared on Jared's face. He suspected that he had a talent for fire skills. The leader of the evil spirits did not calm down, giving orders to his army. Suddenly, one of the fireballs hit him and the elephant he was riding on. The frightened orcs ran to the side to avoid the fate of being crushed by the elephant. Jared turned to their leader, claiming that he could have come down to confront him. After these words, the leader of the evil spirits jumped high into the air. Holding a huge hammer in his hands, he hoped to destroy the king of Civia with it. Using the spell, Jared soared upward, but the leader was not going to let him escape the attack and grabbed the guy by the shirt. With his physical abilities enhanced, Jared grabbed the ogre by the horns, putting up a fight. The leader's servants were too weak, but their leader seemed to be much more capable. Using his fire powers again, Jared fired a ball of flame straight into the face of the evil leader. The flames burned through his entire body. It flowed in an endless stream from the magic circle of the king of Civia. Attempts to escape were futile.